Part 1. Haecceitism. This doctrine holds that objects have primitive thisness beyond all their properties. Two things could be exactly identical in every way, but still be numerically different objects. Consider two identical electrons with the same mass, charge and spin in identical environments. Haecceitism says they are still two distinct things because each has its own unique thisness or haecceity. This thisness cannot be captured by any description or set of properties. It is what makes each thing the particular thing it is, beyond what it is like. Even if you could list every property of an object, you would still miss its essential thisness. This means identity involves something over and above all qualitative features. Haecceity is supposed to be a primitive non-qualitative property that distinguishes individuals. It cannot be analyzed or reduced to anything else, including spatial location, temporal position, or causal history. Each object simply has its own unique way of being that particular object. This creates profound mysteries about how we could ever know about or refer to specific haecceities, since they lie beyond all describable features. Anti-haecceitists deny primitive thisness exists. They argue objects are nothing more than bundles of properties or patterns of qualities. If two things share all the same properties in identical contexts, they are the same thing rather than two things. This debate touches the deepest questions about what makes each thing the unique individual it is, and whether identity transcends all qualitative differences between objects. Part 2. Mereological Nihilism. This doctrine claims that composite objects do not actually exist. According to Mereological Nihilists, there are no tables, chairs, cars, or even human bodies. What we call a table is really just particles arranged in a table-like formation. The table itself is not a real thing, only the particles are real. This applies to everything we normally consider objects. Your body does not exist as a unified thing, only the atoms that make it up exist. This means billions of particles are arranged in a human body-like way, but there is no additional thing called a human body. Only fundamental particles exist, and everything else is just a useful fiction. The nihilist argues that composition never actually occurs in the real world. When we see particles arranged in certain patterns, we mistakenly think a new object has come into existence. But really, only the particles exist, and they have merely changed their spatial relationships to each other. No new entity is created when particles cluster together, regardless of how organized or functional the arrangement becomes. This view eliminates countless philosophical puzzles about when objects begin and end existing. If you slowly replace every part of a ship with new parts, when does it stop being the original ship? The nihilist answer is simple. There never was a ship to begin with, only particles arranged in various patterns over time. This radical solution comes at the cost of denying the existence of almost everything we care about in ordinary life. Part 3. Gunk and Atomless Gunk. Imagine matter that has no smallest parts whatsoever. This hypothetical substance is called gunk. Every piece of gunk can be divided into smaller pieces forever, with no bottom level of indivisible particles. This creates infinite levels of composition going down without end. Gunk challenges our basic assumptions about the building blocks of reality. We naturally think everything must be made of something fundamental, but Gunk suggests reality might be infinitely complex at every level. Each piece contains infinite smaller pieces, each of which contains infinite smaller pieces, and so on forever. This means that even the tiniest speck of gunk contains infinite parts and infinite complexity. The mathematical implications of gunk are staggering. If Gunk exists, then any finite region of space contains infinite objects of infinite different sizes. You could spend eternity discovering new levels of organization within any piece of Gunk, no matter how small. Each level would reveal new structures, new patterns, and new relationships that were completely invisible at higher levels of analysis. Some philosophers argue Gunk is not just possible, but actual. They claim space itself might be infinitely divisible, suggesting physical reality has no fundamental level. If true, this would mean the universe contains infinite complexity, even in the smallest regions of space and matter. Modern physics has not yet determined whether matter has fundamental particles or continues dividing infinitely downward into smaller and smaller components. Part 4. The Principle of Unrestricted Composition. This principle states that any collection of objects, no matter how scattered or unrelated, forms a real composite object. Your left shoe, the moon, and a random pebble on Mars together compose a genuine object. This scattered object exists just as much as any ordinary thing, even though its parts are spread across the solar system. The principle implies there are trillions of bizarre composite objects we never normally think about. Every possible combination of existing things creates a new object. All the red things in the universe compose one giant red object. All things that weigh less than 5 pounds compose another object. Your thoughts right now, and all the sand grains on Earth, compose yet another strange but real entity. The principle generates objects with wildly discontinuous parts and bizarre properties. There exists an object composed of your childhood bicycle, Napoleon's hat, and the core of Jupiter. This object has parts separated by vast distances and time periods, yet it counts as a single unified thing. Its properties depend on the properties of all its scattered parts, creating objects with seemingly impossible combinations of features. This leads to an explosion of objects that most people find absurd. But philosophers defend it because it provides precise rules about when composition occurs. Instead of vague answers about when parts form wholes, unrestricted composition says parts always form wholes, no matter what. This eliminates arbitrary restrictions on composition while creating a universe populated by countless strange but genuine objects that exist beyond our ordinary experience. Part 5. Modal Realism. David Lewis proposed one of the most shocking theories in all of philosophy. He argued that every possible world actually exists as a concrete physical reality. This means there are infinite universes where every possible variation of events actually happens. In one world you are reading this right now, in another you never existed, and in yet another you are the ruler of Earth. Lewis claimed these worlds are not abstract ideas or mathematical concepts. They are real places with real people living real lives. The only difference between our world and all others is that we happen to live in this one. When we say something is possible, we are actually describing what happens in some other concrete universe. These worlds are causally isolated from each other, which explains why we cannot visit them or communicate across worlds. Each world is a maximal connected space-time region containing everything that can interact causally. This means there are worlds where the laws of physics are completely different, where mathematics works differently, and where logic itself might operate under alien principles. Some worlds contain talking donkeys, others have backwards time, and still others consist of nothing but purple oceans. This theory solves many philosophical problems but creates an unbelievable ontological cost. It requires believing in infinite universes filled with infinite copies of everyone who ever lived. Most philosophers reject this as too extreme, but Lewis defended it until his death as the most elegant solution to the nature of possibility and necessity. The theory suggests that everything that could possibly happen does happen somewhere in the vast multiverse of concrete worlds. Part 6. Temporal Parts Theory. You are not a three-dimensional object persisting through time. Instead, you're a four-dimensional object extended through time just as you are extended through space. Different temporal parts of you exist at different times, similar to how different spatial parts of you exist at different locations. The you of yesterday is a different temporal part than the you of today. This theory treats time like another dimension of space. Just as your hand is a spatial part of your body, your childhood self is a temporal part of your complete four-dimensional being. The entire four-dimensional object, stretching from your birth to your death, is the real you. What we call your life is really just the four-dimensional shape you make through space-time. Change becomes reinterpreted as variation across temporal parts. When you grow taller, different temporal parts of you have different heights. This solves puzzles about how objects can have incompatible properties at different times. Your 5-year-old temporal part is short, while your adult temporal part is tall, with no contradiction. The theory implies that your past and future selves exist just as much as your present self. Right now, your childhood temporal part is playing somewhere in the four-dimensional block universe. Your death is already there too, existing timelessly as the final temporal boundary of your four-dimensional existence. This creates a static, eternal picture of reality where nothing truly comes into being or passes away, only different temporal parts are revealed as time unfolds. Part 7. The Ontology of Holes. Do holes exist as real things, or are they merely absences? This question divides philosophers into those who believe holes are genuine entities and those who deny their existence. Hole realists argue that holes have clear spatial boundaries, can move from place to place, and can be counted. You can point to a hole, measure its volume, and watch it change shape over time. Holes seem to have causal powers despite being essentially nothing. A hole in your roof causes rain to enter your house. A hole in a dam causes flooding. These causal interactions suggest holes must exist to participate in causal relationships. But holes present deep puzzles about the nature of existence. They are defined entirely by what they lack rather than what they contain. A hole in Swiss cheese is not made of anything, yet it has a definite shape and location. It can move when the cheese moves and disappear when the cheese is eaten. Hole eliminativists counter that holes are just ways of talking about how matter is arranged. When we say there is a hole in the cheese, we really mean the cheese is arranged in a certain pattern. The hole is not an additional thing beyond the cheese and its arrangement. This debate reveals deep questions about what kinds of things deserve to be called real, and whether absences can be genuine features of reality. Part 8. Bundle Theory of Objects. Objects are nothing more than collections or bundles of properties. An apple is not a thing that has redness, roundness, and sweetness. Instead, the apple just is the bundle consisting of redness, roundness, sweetness, and other properties. There is no underlying substance or thing that possesses these properties. This eliminates the distinction between objects and their properties. Properties are not things that belong to objects, they are the only things that exist. What we call objects are really just places where certain properties are bundled together. The bundling itself creates the appearance of substantial objects. Bundle theory faces the problem of explaining what holds properties together in bundles. Why do certain properties cluster together to form what we call individual objects? Different bundle theorists propose different solutions, from fundamental bundling relations to spatio-temporal coincidence. Some suggest that properties naturally attract each other in certain combinations. The theory also struggles with explaining how the same property can exist in multiple bundles simultaneously. If redness is a constituent of both this apple and that fire truck, how can one property be in two places at once? This leads to debates about whether properties are universals shared across bundles or particular tropes unique to each bundle. But the basic insight remains. Objects might be nothing over and above their properties arranged in specific patterns. Part 9. Trope Theory. Properties themselves are particular individual things rather than universal qualities. The redness of this apple is a different individual thing than the redness of that apple. Each red object has its own unique redness trope, even though all red tropes resemble each other perfectly. This means there are billions of different redness tropes throughout the universe. Trope theory attempts to solve the problem of universals without postulating abstract objects. Instead of one universal redness shared by all red things, there are countless individual redness tropes. Objects are then bundles of tropes rather than bundles of universal properties. Your apple consists of its particular redness trope, roundness trope, sweetness trope, and so on. This creates a world populated entirely by individual concrete particulars. Even properties are particular things located in specific places and times. Two identical tropes are still numerically distinct individuals, just as two identical twins are distinct people. This eliminates abstract universals while preserving the idea that objects have genuine properties. The theory faces questions about what makes similar tropes resemble each other so perfectly. If each redness trope is a unique individual, why do they all look exactly the same? Some trope theorists invoke primitive resemblance relations, while others appeal to natural classes of similar tropes. The challenge is explaining apparent universality using only particular individual things without appealing to shared abstract properties. Part 10. The problem of material constitution. Can two different objects occupy exactly the same space at the same time? Consider a statue and the lump of clay from which it is made. They seem to be in the same place at the same time, but they have different properties. The statue was created yesterday, but the clay existed for months before being shaped. If the statue and clay are identical, then the same thing both was and was not created yesterday. But if they are different objects, then two distinct things occupy the same space simultaneously. Both options seem problematic for different reasons. This creates one of the deepest puzzles about the relationship between objects and the matter that constitutes them. The problem extends beyond statues to virtually all composite objects. Your body and the collection of cells that make it up seem to have different persistence conditions. The cells are constantly being replaced, but your body persists through these changes. This suggests they might be different objects sharing the same location and matter. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept coincident objects sharing the same location. Others argue that only one object really exists, with statue and clay being different ways of describing the same thing. Still others deny that composition ever really occurs, solving the problem by eliminating composite objects entirely. Each solution has far-reaching implications for how we understand the material world and our place within it. Part 11. Presentism. Only the present moment exists. The past has stopped existing and the future does not yet exist. Right now is the only time that is real, and everything else is either no longer real or not yet real. This view conflicts dramatically with modern physics but captures our intuitive experience of time. Presentism faces the challenge of explaining what we mean by the present moment. Is there a single universal now that applies throughout the universe? But relativity theory shows that simultaneity is relative to reference frames. Events that are simultaneous in one frame of reference occur at different times in another frame. If presentism is true, then dinosaurs do not exist anywhere in reality. They are not located in the past because the past does not exist. Similarly, future generations of humans do not exist because the future is not real. Only currently existing things populate the universe at any given moment. This creates puzzles about the truth conditions of statements about the past and future. What makes it true that dinosaurs existed if they do not exist anywhere in reality? Presentists must explain how past tensed statements can be true without past objects existing. They typically appeal to present evidence or present properties that ground truths about non-present times without requiring non-present objects to exist. Part 12. Eternalism. All times are equally real. Past, present and future events all exist timelessly in a four-dimensional block universe. Your birth, your reading of these words and your death all exist simultaneously in the block. The passage of time is an illusion created by our limited perspective on the eternal four-dimensional structure. From the eternal perspective, nothing ever truly happens or changes. Events are simply located at different temporal coordinates, just as objects are located at different spatial coordinates. Change becomes redefined as variation across the temporal dimension rather than genuine alteration of objects. Your childhood and adulthood are both real, just located at different temporal positions. This view suggests that worrying about the future or grieving the past are based on fundamental misunderstandings. Your deceased relatives exist just as much as you do, simply at different temporal locations. Your future self is already there in the block universe, living out experiences that seem future to you now. Death becomes merely reaching the temporal boundary of your four-dimensional existence, rather than ceasing to exist. Eternalism aligns well with relativity theory, but conflicts with our experience of temporal becoming. We seem to experience genuine change and the creation of new facts about the present. Eternalists must explain why we have such strong illusions about temporal passage if all times are equally real. They typically appeal to psychological or thermodynamic asymmetries that create the appearance of temporal flow without genuine temporal becoming. Part 13. The growing block theory. The past and present exist, but the future does not yet exist. Reality consists of a growing four-dimensional block that continuously adds new slices of present existence. As time passes, more of reality comes into being, expanding the block universe moment by moment. The future is genuinely open because future events do not yet exist anywhere. This theory attempts to combine the objective reality of temporal becoming with the equal reality of past events. Unlike presentism, it allows past objects and events to exist, making true statements about the past unproblematic. Unlike eternalism, it preserves genuine temporal becoming by denying the existence of future events. The present moment marks the growing edge of reality, where new existence continuously emerges. The growing block faces questions about what drives the growth of reality. What mechanism adds new slices of existence to the block? Some versions invoke primitive temporal becoming as a fundamental feature of reality. Others appeal to consciousness or physical processes that gradually actualize potential future states. The theory also struggles with relativity theory, which denies objective simultaneity. If there is no universal present moment, then there is no clear way to define the growing edge of the block. Different reference frames would disagree about which events exist and which are still merely future possibilities. This creates tensions between the growing block picture and our best physical theories about the nature of space and time. Part 14. Perdurantism versus Endurantism. Objects persist through time in fundamentally different ways. Perdurantism claims objects have temporal parts at different times, like a road has spatial parts at different locations. Endurantism claims objects are wholly present at each moment they exist, without temporal parts. This debate concerns the deepest nature of persistence and identity through time. According to Perdurantism, you never experience your whole self at any single moment. You only experience your current temporal part, while your past and future temporal parts exist at other times. Growing up involves acquiring new temporal parts with different properties, rather than the same object changing its properties. Your childhood temporal part remains forever young, while your adult temporal parts age and develop. Endurantism maintains that the whole object exists at each moment of its existence. You are completely present right now, not just a temporal slice of a larger four-dimensional entity. When you change, the same object acquires new properties while losing old ones. This preserves the common-sense idea that objects genuinely alter their features over time. The debate connects to puzzles about personal identity and moral responsibility. If Perdurantism is true, then punishment targets a different temporal part than the one that committed the crime. If Endurantism is true, then the same person who committed the crime receives the punishment. These competing pictures of persistence have profound implications for ethics, personal survival, and the nature of temporal existence. Part 15. Substance Dualism. Mind and matter are completely different types of substance that interact mysteriously. Mental substance thinks but does not extend through space, while physical substance extends through space but cannot think. Humans are combinations of both substances, with immaterial minds somehow connected to material brains. This creates the notorious mind-body problem of explaining how different substances can causally interact. René Descartes proposed that mental and physical substances meet at the pineal gland in the brain. But critics pointed out that this just pushes the problem back one step. How can an immaterial mind influence anything physical, even a tiny gland? The interaction seems to violate the causal closure of the physical world. Substance dualists must explain how mental causation works without appealing to physical mechanisms. Some invoke primitive psychophysical laws that govern mind-matter interactions. Others appeal to divine intervention or special causal powers unique to mental substance. But these solutions often seem ad hoc or scientifically problematic. The theory faces additional challenges from neuroscience, which increasingly shows correlations between mental states and brain states. If mind and brain are separate substances, why do mental changes so consistently accompany neural changes? Dualists must explain these correlations without reducing mind to brain, or making the mental substance causally irrelevant. Despite these problems, substance dualism remains attractive to those who believe consciousness cannot be explained purely physically. Part 16. Property dualism. Mental and physical properties are fundamentally different types of properties of the same underlying substance. Instead of two different kinds of substance, there is one kind of substance that can have both mental and physical properties. Your brain is a physical object with mass and electrical activity, but it also has mental properties like consciousness and thoughts. These mental properties are irreducible to physical properties despite occurring in physical objects. This view avoids the interaction problem that plagues substance dualism. Mental and physical properties belong to the same objects, so no mysterious cross-substance causation is required. Mental properties can influence physical properties within the same substance, just as different physical properties influence each other. This makes mental causation no more mysterious than ordinary physical causation. Property dualism still faces the challenge of explaining how mental properties relate to physical properties. Are they completely independent aspects of reality, or do they depend on physical properties in some way? Some property dualists embrace epiphenomenalism, claiming mental properties are caused by physical properties but have no causal powers themselves. Others defend genuine mental causation while maintaining the irreducibility of mental properties. The theory must also explain why mental properties seem to emerge only in certain complex physical systems. Why do brains have mental properties while rocks do not? This leads to questions about the distribution of consciousness throughout nature, and whether mental properties might be more widespread than commonly assumed. Some property dualists embrace panpsychism, claiming all physical objects have at least primitive mental properties. Part 17. Panpsychism. All physical objects have mental properties or consciousness of some form. Electrons, protons, and quarks all have primitive experiences or proto-conscious states. Complex consciousness, like human awareness, emerges from combinations of countless micro-conscious components. Your brain consciousness results from integrating billions of micro-conscious neurons and particles. This solves the hard problem of consciousness by making mental properties fundamental features of reality. Instead of explaining how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, panpsychism starts with consciousness at the foundation. The challenge becomes explaining how micro-conscious components combine into unified macro-conscious experiences. This is known as the combination problem for panpsychist theories. Different versions of panpsychism propose different types of fundamental mental properties. Some suggest basic particles have simple experiences like primitive sensations or feelings. Others propose more abstract mental properties, like proto-intentionality or information processing capacities. The goal is finding mental properties simple enough to exist in fundamental particles, yet complex enough to ground human consciousness. Panpsychism faces the challenge of explaining why we do not experience the individual consciousness of our constituent particles. If your neurons are conscious, why do you not experience their individual mental states? Panpsychists appeal to various combination mechanisms that integrate micro-experiences into unified macro-experiences. But critics argue that no combination mechanism can explain the apparent unity of consciousness from a multitude of separate conscious components. Part 18. Eliminative Materialism. Our common-sense understanding of mind is fundamentally mistaken and will eventually be eliminated by neuroscience. There are no such things as beliefs, desires, or conscious experiences as ordinarily conceived. These mental concepts are like obsolete scientific theories that will be replaced by accurate neuroscientific descriptions. Future science will show that folk psychology is as mistaken as ancient theories about vital spirits or phlogiston. Paul and Patricia Churchland argue that mental concepts are theoretical posits that fail to correspond to brain reality. Just as we abandoned the theory of four bodily humours, we should abandon talk of propositional attitudes and qualia. Advanced neuroscience will replace mental vocabulary with precise descriptions of neural activity and computational processes. People will learn to describe their inner lives using the language of neuroscience rather than folk psychological concepts. This view faces the challenge of explaining the apparent obviousness of mental phenomena. It seems undeniable that you have conscious experiences and mental states. Eliminativists respond that seeming is not being, and that introspection is unreliable about the nature of inner processes. They compare mental concepts to other intuitive but false theories about natural phenomena. The position also struggles with self-refutation problems. If beliefs do not exist, then eliminativists cannot believe their own theory. If theories are mental representations, then eliminating the mental eliminates the possibility of scientific theories. Eliminativists must carefully reformulate their position to avoid claiming that non-existent mental states support their elimination of mental states. Part 19. Multiple Realizability. The same mental state can be realized by different physical systems. Human pain, alien pain, and artificial intelligence pain could all be the same mental state, despite involving completely different physical processes. Mental states are defined by their functional roles rather than their physical implementations. This suggests that psychology should be independent of neuroscience, just as software is independent of hardware. Multiple realizability challenges reductive physicalism, which identifies mental states with specific brain states. If pain can be realized by human brains, silicon computers, or alien neurology, then pain cannot be identical to any particular physical state. Instead, mental states are abstract functional states that can be implemented in various physical substrates. This supports functionalism about the mind and the autonomy of psychological explanation. Critics argue that multiple realizability is more limited than originally thought. While the same mental state might be realized differently across species, individual organisms might require specific neural implementations. Human pain might always involve the same neural pathways, even if alien pain involves different mechanisms. This would allow species-specific psychophysical identities without undermining the coherence of reductive approaches. The debate has implications for artificial intelligence and cognitive science. If mental states are multiply realizable, then machines could genuinely think regardless of their physical composition. But if mental states require specific biological implementations, then artificial consciousness might be impossible. The resolution affects whether consciousness depends on particular physical arrangements or abstract computational patterns that could exist in any suitable substrate. Part 20. The Chinese Room Argument. Understanding cannot be reduced to following syntactic rules. John Searle imagined a person in a room with rule books for manipulating Chinese characters without understanding Chinese. By following the rules, they could respond appropriately to Chinese questions while remaining completely ignorant of what the characters mean. This shows that syntax is insufficient for semantics, and computation alone cannot produce understanding. The argument targets strong artificial intelligence claims that appropriately programmed computers would literally understand language. Computers manipulate symbols according to syntactic rules, just like the person in the Chinese room. No matter how sophisticated the program, the computer lacks genuine understanding of what the symbols represent. Understanding requires more than correct input-output behavior and symbol manipulation. Critics respond with various strategies to defend computational approaches to mind. The system's reply argues that while the person does not understand Chinese, the entire room system does understand. The robot reply suggests that understanding requires sensorimotor interaction with the environment, not just abstract symbol manipulation. The brain simulator reply proposes that understanding would emerge from simulating the causal structure of understanding brains. Searle rejects all these responses, maintaining that syntax can never produce genuine semantics. He argues that consciousness and understanding require specific biological properties that cannot be replicated in digital computers. The debate continues over whether consciousness requires biological implementation or could emerge from any system with appropriate causal organization. This touches fundamental questions about the nature of mind and the possibility of artificial consciousness. Part 21. The Extended Mind. The boundaries of the mind extend beyond the skull to include external tools and technologies. Your smartphone contains part of your memory system, making it literally part of your extended mind. The pencil and paper you use for complex calculations become temporary components of your cognitive system. Mental processes can be distributed across internal neural mechanisms and external environmental structures. Andy Clark and David Chalmers argue that cognitive processes should be individuated by their functional roles rather than their physical locations. If an external tool plays the same functional role as an internal cognitive process, then it counts as part of the mind. Your phone's contact list functions like biological memory, storing and retrieving information when needed. This makes it a literal extension of your memory system rather than merely a tool you use. The extended mind thesis has implications for personal identity and cognitive enhancement. If external technologies become parts of our minds, then upgrading our devices upgrades our mental capacities. Losing your smartphone might involve literally losing part of your mind, rather than just losing access to information. This suggests that the self extends beyond biological boundaries to include technological extensions. Critics argue that the extended mind conflates genuine cognitive processes with mere tool use. There seem to be important differences between biological memory and external storage devices. Internal cognitive processes have different temporal dynamics, reliability and accessibility than external tools. The debate centers on whether these differences matter for determining the boundaries of mind or whether functional similarity is sufficient for mental extension. Part 22. Causal exclusion problem. If mental events have sufficient physical causes, then mental causes become causally irrelevant. Your decision to raise your arm seems to cause the movement, but neural events in your brain are also sufficient to cause the same movement. This creates causal overdetermination, where the same effect has multiple sufficient causes. But overdetermination seems rare in nature, suggesting that either mental or physical causes must be eliminated. The problem arises from three seemingly plausible principles that cannot all be true together. Mental events cause physical events have sufficient physical causes, and effects are not systematically overdetermined. Something must give, But each option has serious costs for our understanding of mind and causation. Eliminating mental causation makes consciousness epiphenomenal and morally irrelevant. Some philosophers respond by denying the causal closure of the physical domain. They argue that physical events sometimes lack sufficient physical causes, leaving room for mental causation. Others defend systematic overdetermination as a genuine feature of mental-physical interactions. Still others identify mental causes with physical causes, making the overdetermination merely apparent. The exclusion problem highlights tensions between our manifest image of ourselves as conscious agents and the scientific image of purely physical causation. If physical science completely explains behavior, then consciousness appears causally irrelevant to what we do. But if consciousness genuinely affects behavior, then physical science seems incomplete. Resolving this tension requires rethinking either the nature of mental causation or the completeness of physical explanation. Part 23. The hard problem of consciousness. Explaining why there is something it is like to have experiences poses a unique challenge for science. We can explain the functional aspects of consciousness like attention, memory, and behavioral responses. But explaining why these processes are accompanied by subjective experience seems to require something beyond physical explanation. The qualitative, subjective nature of consciousness appears to resist reduction to objective physical processes. David Chalmers distinguishes the hard problem from easy problems of consciousness. Easy problems concern the cognitive functions associated with consciousness and can be solved by standard scientific methods. The hard problem concerns the existence of experience itself and why there is an inner subjective dimension to mental life. Even complete knowledge of brain function might not explain why there is anything it is like to be conscious. The hard problem challenges physicalism, the view that everything is physical. If consciousness involves non-physical properties, then physicalism is false. Some philosophers embrace this conclusion and adopt dualist theories of mind. Others argue that the hard problem is based on conceptual confusion or that consciousness will eventually be explained physically. Proposed solutions include eliminativism, which denies that consciousness exists as commonly conceived. Panpsychism makes consciousness fundamental rather than something to be explained. Mysterianism accepts that humans are cognitively incapable of solving the hard problem. Each approach has costs and benefits for our understanding of mind and its place in nature. Part 24. Zombie argument. It seems conceivable that there could exist beings physically identical to conscious humans but lacking any inner experience. These philosophical zombies would behave exactly like normal humans while having no subjective consciousness whatsoever. They would claim to have experiences, report qualia, and exhibit all the functional properties of consciousness without actually being conscious. If zombies are even logically possible, then consciousness cannot be identical to physical properties. The argument proceeds from conceivability to possibility to the falsity of physicalism. If zombies are conceivable, then they are metaphysically possible in some possible world. If zombies are possible, then consciousness is not logically supervenient on physical properties. If consciousness does not logically supervene on the physical, then physicalism is false. Physicalists respond by denying the conceivability of zombies. They argue that once we fully understand what physical processes involve, we will see that consciousness necessarily accompanies them. The appearance of conceivability results from incomplete understanding of the physical facts. Complete knowledge would reveal that zombies are actually inconceivable and impossible. Others question the inference from conceivability to possibility, or from possibility to the falsity of physicalism. Even if zombies are possible, this might not refute physicalism if consciousness is a posteriori identical to physical properties. The debate involves complex issues about the relationship between concepts, possibilities, and identities. It remains one of the most discussed arguments in contemporary philosophy of mind. Part 25. The Knowledge Argument. Complete physical knowledge seems insufficient for knowledge of conscious experience. Frank Jackson imagined Mary, a brilliant scientist who knows all physical facts about colour but has never experienced colour herself. When Mary first sees a red tomato, she learns something new about what red experiences are like. This suggests that physical facts do not exhaust all facts about consciousness. The argument concludes that there are non-physical facts about consciousness that cannot be captured by physical science. Mary gains new knowledge when she experiences colour, but this knowledge is not physical knowledge. Therefore, consciousness involves non-physical properties that escape purely physical description. This supports property dualism and challenges physicalist theories of mind. Physicalists have developed sophisticated responses to the knowledge argument. The ability hypothesis claims that Mary gains new abilities rather than new propositional knowledge. The phenomenal concept strategy argues that Mary acquires new concepts for the same physical facts she already knew. The incomplete knowledge response suggests that Mary did not really know all physical facts before her release. The debate involves subtle questions about the nature of knowledge, concepts, and facts. Whether Mary learns new facts or just new ways of accessing old facts has implications for the completeness of physical description. The argument continues to influence discussions about consciousness and the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. It highlights the puzzle of how objective science can capture subjective aspects of reality. Part 26. Personal Identity and Psychological Continuity. What makes you the same person over time might be psychological connections rather than physical continuity. You are the same person as your childhood self because of memory links, personality traits, and mental dispositions that connect your current psychology to your past psychology. Physical changes to your body do not threaten personal identity as long as psychological continuity is preserved. This suggests that personal identity is a matter of mind rather than matter. John Locke proposed that memory is the key to personal identity. You are the same person as whoever you can remember being. This accounts for our sense that amnesia threatens personal identity while physical changes do not. But critics point out that memory is fallible and that we forget most of our experiences without losing personal identity. Modern psychological continuity theories expand beyond memory to include broader psychological connections. Overlapping chains of memory, personality, beliefs and desires create psychological continuity over time. You need not remember your childhood directly if there are intermediate links that connect your current psychology to your past psychology. This creates a more flexible account that can handle memory loss and psychological change. The theory faces puzzles about branching cases where one person's psychology continues in multiple bodies. If your brain were split and transplanted into two bodies, which resulting person would be you? Psychological continuity theory suggests both would be you, but identity seems to require uniqueness. These cases reveal tensions between our concepts of survival and numerical identity that challenge all theories of personal identity. Part 27. The Ship of Theseus. If you gradually replace every part of an object, is the resulting object the same as the original? The ancient Ship of Theseus had its planks replaced one by one until no original material remained. This creates a puzzle about the persistence conditions of composite objects through material change. The problem becomes more complex if the old planks are used to build another ship that also claims to be the original. Different theories of persistence give different answers to the puzzle. Material composition theories suggest that changing the parts changes the object. Functional continuity theories argue that maintaining the same function preserves identity despite material changes. Gradual change theories claim that slow replacement preserves identity, while sudden replacement does not. The puzzle applies to human bodies, which replace most of their cells over time. Are you the same physical object as your childhood self, given that virtually all your atoms have been replaced? Some argue that continuity of form or biological function preserves bodily identity. Others conclude that persons are not identical to their bodies, but rather persist through different material substrates. The problem reveals the vagueness and context dependence of our identity concepts. Whether the rebuilt ship is the same ship might depend on practical interests rather than metaphysical facts. This suggests that identity judgments are partially conventional rather than discoveries about objective identity relations. The puzzle illustrates how seemingly simple questions about persistence can lead to deep philosophical problems about the nature of objects and time. Part 28. Four-dimensionalism. Objects are four-dimensional entities extended through time as well as space. You are not a three-dimensional object that persists through time, but rather a four-dimensional space-time worm that stretches from your birth to your death. Different temporal parts of this worm exist at different times, just as different spatial parts exist at different locations. What we call change is really just variation in properties across the temporal dimension. This view solves many puzzles about persistence and change. Objects can have incompatible properties at different times because different temporal parts have these properties. You can be both tall and short by having tall temporal parts and short temporal parts. There is no mysterious way that the same object changes its properties over time. Four-dimensionalism implies that past and future temporal parts exist just as much as present temporal parts. Your childhood self exists somewhere in the four-dimensional block universe. Death is merely reaching the temporal boundary of your four-dimensional existence rather than ceasing to exist entirely. This creates a static, eternal picture of reality where nothing truly comes into being or passes away. Critics argue that four-dimensionalism conflicts with our experience of genuine change and temporal becoming. We seem to experience real alterations in objects rather than just variation across temporal dimensions. The theory also faces questions about which temporal parts count as stages of the same object. What unifies your childhood and adult temporal parts into a single four-dimensional entity remains unclear. Part 29. Endurantism. Objects are wholly present at each moment of their existence without having temporal parts. When you persist through time, the entire object exists at each moment rather than different temporal slices existing at different times. Change involves the same object acquiring and losing properties over time rather than different temporal parts having different properties. This preserves the common-sense view that objects genuinely alter their features while remaining numerically identical. Endurantism faces the problem of temporary intrinsics. How can the same object be both straight and bent if it is a straight stick that later becomes bent? The endurantist must either deny that shapes are intrinsic properties or explain how objects can have incompatible intrinsic properties. Various solutions involve relativizing properties to times or appealing to different ways of having properties. The view aligns with our experience of persistence and moral responsibility. You are the same person who made promises in the past and will be held accountable in the future. Endurantism supports the idea that persons are unified agents who persist through psychological and bodily changes. This makes personal survival and moral assessment more straightforward than under four-dimensional alternatives. Endurantism must explain the apparent relativity of simultaneity discovered by special relativity. If there is no absolute simultaneity, then there is no objective fact about when an object is wholly present. Different reference frames would disagree about which temporal extent constitutes the object being wholly present. This creates tensions between endurantist metaphysics and relativistic physics that require careful resolution. Part 30. The problem of the many. Vague objects like clouds seem to have indefinitely many precise boundaries. A cloud has billions of possible precise boundaries depending on which water molecules you include as parts of the cloud. Each boundary seems equally good, but they cannot all be the real boundary of the cloud. This suggests that there are actually billions of distinct cloud objects occupying nearly the same space. The problem arises whenever objects have vague boundaries. Your body has indefinitely many possible precise boundaries depending on which molecules you count as parts. Each way of drawing the boundary creates a different object with a slightly different shape and composition. If all boundaries are equally legitimate, then you are really billions of slightly different person objects. Some philosophers embrace the many and accept that vague objects are really indefinitely many precise objects. What we call a single cloud is actually a vast collection of overlapping cloud objects. Others reject vague objects entirely, arguing that reality contains only objects with precise boundaries. Still others maintain that there is genuine metaphysical vagueness in the world that resists precise description. The problem connects to issues about the nature of properties, identity, and indeterminacy. If objects can have vague boundaries, then identity relations might themselves be vague or indeterminate. This challenges classical logic, which assumes that identity is always determinate. The problem of the many reveals how vagueness creates deep puzzles about the number and nature of objects in the world. Part 31. Vague objects. Some objects have genuinely indeterminate boundaries rather than merely unknown precise boundaries. A mountain does not have a definite edge where it stops and the surrounding terrain begins. This vagueness is not due to ignorance, but reflects genuine indeterminacy in the world itself. There is simply no fact of the matter about exactly where the mountain ends. Vague objects challenge classical logic, which assumes every proposition is either true or false. The proposition that a particular rock is part of the mountain is neither determinately true nor determinately false. This suggests we need three-valued logic with true, false, and indeterminate truth values. Alternatively, we might need to abandon classical logic entirely in favor of systems that can handle vagueness. Critics argue that vagueness is always epistemic rather than metaphysical. Objects have precise boundaries that we cannot discover due to practical limitations. The appearance of vague objects results from our imperfect concepts and measurement abilities rather than genuine indeterminacy in reality. On this view, perfect knowledge would eliminate all apparent vagueness by revealing precise boundaries. The debate has implications for the relationship between language, concepts, and reality. If vagueness is merely linguistic, then sharpening our concepts would eliminate vague objects. But if vagueness is metaphysical, then reality itself contains irreducible indeterminacy that no amount of conceptual refinement can eliminate. This touches fundamental questions about whether the world has a completely determinate structure independent of our ways of describing it. Part 32. Arbitrary undetached parts. Every object has countless proper parts that we normally ignore. Your body contains an object consisting of your left ear plus your right elbow. This scattered object exists just as much as more natural parts like your arm or leg. Ontology includes billions of arbitrary undetached parts that carve up objects in bizarre ways. These arbitrary parts have strange properties and persistence conditions. The ear-elbow object changes shape when you move your arm, even though your ear remains stationary. It has a discontinuous spatial distribution and no obvious function or unity. Yet mereological principles suggest it exists as genuinely as any ordinary object. The existence of arbitrary parts follows from unrestricted mereological principles. If any collection of things composes an object, then any subset of an object's parts composes a proper part. This generates countless strange objects that divide up reality in ways that ignore natural boundaries and functional organization. Most of these objects lack names or concepts because they are too bizarre to be practically useful. Some philosophers reject arbitrary parts by restricting composition to natural or unified collections. Others embrace them as genuine features of reality that our concepts and interests lead us to ignore. The debate involves questions about whether metaphysics should follow common sense or abstract principles. It also touches issues about the relationship between natural language and the fundamental structure of reality. Part 33. Simple versus complex objects. Are fundamental objects simple or complex? Atomists argue that reality ultimately consists of simple, indivisible particles with no proper parts. Everything else is composed of these fundamental simples arranged in various patterns. This provides a foundation for the material world and explains composition in terms of arrangement relations among basic building blocks. The alternative is that reality contains only complex objects with no bottom level of simple parts. Every object has proper parts, each of which has further proper parts, continuing infinitely downward. This creates infinite complexity at every level of reality with no fundamental foundation. Even the smallest visible objects contain infinite hierarchies of smaller objects. Arguments for simples include the need for foundational elements and the apparent finitude of physical objects. If everything had proper parts, then finite objects would contain infinite parts, which seems impossible. Arguments against simples include the infinite divisibility of space and the lack of evidence for truly indivisible particles. Modern physics has not discovered any particles that cannot be further analyzed into component structures. The question connects to issues about the nature of space, matter, and mathematical infinity. If space is infinitely divisible, then material objects might be infinitely complex. But if space consists of discrete units, then objects might be built from simple spatial atoms. The resolution depends on deep questions about the fundamental structure of physical reality that might require empirical investigation rather than pure philosophical argument. Part 34. Classical Mereology. The relationship between parts and wholes follows precise logical principles that govern all composition. Classical Mereology provides axioms that define when objects compose larger objects and how composition behaves. These principles treat composition as a purely logical relation like identity or membership. Any collection of objects automatically composes a larger object according to unrestricted composition principles. The axioms include reflexivity, which states that every object is a part of itself. Antisymmetry ensures that if two objects are parts of each other, then they are identical. Transitivity means that parts of parts are parts of the whole. These principles create a mathematical structure that mirrors Boolean algebra and set theory. Classical Mereology leads to controversial consequences that many find counterintuitive. It implies that any collection of objects, no matter how scattered, composes a genuine object. Your left shoe and the Eiffel Tower together compose a real but scattered object. This creates billions of bizarre objects that seem to have no unity or significance. Critics propose restricted Mereologies that limit composition to collections with appropriate unity or causal integration. Others defend classical Mereology as the simplest and most elegant theory of composition. The debate involves questions about whether Mereology should follow mathematical principles or respect common-sense judgments about which collections form genuine objects. It also touches issues about the relationship between logic and ontology in determining the fundamental structure of reality. Part 35. Contact versus overlap. Do objects that touch actually overlap or merely come arbitrarily close without sharing parts? When two spheres touch at a point, do they share that point as a common part, or do they approach without overlapping? This question reveals deep issues about the nature of spatial boundaries and material contact. The answer affects how we understand collisions, surfaces, and the interaction between distinct objects. If touching objects overlap, then contact involves shared boundaries or surface regions. Two touching spheres would share a boundary point as a common part. This makes contact a genuine sharing relation where objects literally have parts in common. But it raises questions about how distinct objects can share the same parts without becoming identical. If touching objects merely approach without overlapping, then contact becomes a limiting case of near approach. Objects can come arbitrarily close without ever sharing spatial regions or boundaries. This preserves the distinctness of separate objects but makes contact itself mysterious. What distinguishes true contact from extremely close approach if no overlap occurs? The problem connects to issues about the nature of space, boundaries and material objects. Different theories of space give different answers about whether points can be shared between distinct regions. The resolution also depends on whether boundaries are parts of objects or merely limits that do not themselves exist. These abstract questions have implications for physics, where contact forces and collisions play fundamental roles in material interactions. Part 36. The special composition question. Under what conditions do objects compose a larger object? When do scattered parts come together to form a genuine whole rather than merely a collection of separate things? This question challenges us to specify precise criteria for when composition occurs. Different answers have radically different implications for how many objects exist in the world. Some philosophers defend universal composition, where any collection of objects always composes a larger object. This creates countless bizarre composite objects, but provides clear and simple rules. Others restrict composition to collections with appropriate causal integration, functional unity, or natural boundaries. Still others deny that composition ever occurs, accepting only fundamental particles as genuine objects. Proposed answers include composition when objects are in contact, when they are causally integrated, when they serve a common function, or when they form a natural unit. Each criterion faces counterexamples and boundary cases that test its adequacy. Some objects seem unified despite lacking the proposed criteria, while other objects satisfy the criteria without seeming unified. This suggests that composition might be vague, conventional or context-dependent, rather than governed by precise natural laws. The question connects to debates about emergence, reduction, and levels of description in science. If composite objects exist, then there might be emergent properties and higher-level causal powers. If only fundamental particles exist, then all causation occurs at the most basic physical level. The special composition question thus has implications for the unity of science and the reality of macro-level phenomena. Part 37. Spatial location and exact location. Objects can be located at places in different ways with different degrees of precision. You are located in your city, your building, and your exact spatial region. But these represent different location relations rather than increasingly precise specifications of the same relation. Exact location involves perfect spatial coincidence, while broader location involves containing or being contained within regions. The distinction matters for questions about the location of parts and wholes. If your hand is exactly located in a hand-shaped region, where is your whole body exactly located? Some argue that objects can only be exactly located at regions they fill completely. Others allow objects to be exactly located at multiple regions corresponding to different ways of measuring their boundaries. Complex questions arise about the location of scattered objects and objects with vague boundaries. If an object has parts in different places, is it exactly located at the fusion of those places or merely broadly located in various regions? If boundaries are vague, then exact location itself might be indeterminate. This creates puzzles about whether spatial location relations are always determinate and well-defined. The problem connects to issues about the nature of space, boundaries, and material constitution. Different theories of space provide different frameworks for understanding location relations. The resolution also depends on whether spatial regions are abstract mathematical entities or concrete physical things. These questions affect how we understand the relationship between geometry and physics in describing the material world. Part 38. Fictional Objects. Do fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes exist in some sense? We can make true statements about Holmes, such as that he lived on Baker Street and solved mysteries. But Holmes never actually existed as a real person in the actual world. This creates puzzles about the truth conditions of statements involving fictional characters and the ontological status of fictional objects. Realists about fictional objects argue that they exist as abstract objects created by acts of storytelling. Holmes exists as an abstract object with properties determined by Conan Doyle's stories. This explains how we can refer to Holmes and make true statements about his fictional properties. But it commits us to a realm of abstract fictional objects that some find ontologically costly. Anti-realists deny that fictional objects exist and seek alternative explanations of fictional discourse. Some appeal to pretense or make-believe to explain how we can meaningfully discuss non-existent objects. Others use paraphrase strategies that eliminate apparent reference to fictional objects. Still others embrace error theories that deny the literal truth of statements about fictional characters. The debate has implications for other disputed objects like possible objects, mythological beings, and theoretical entities. If fictional objects exist, then existence might be cheaper and easier than commonly assumed. If they do not exist, then we need sophisticated theories to explain meaningful discourse about non-existent things. The resolution affects fundamental questions about reference, truth, and the scope of our ontological commitments. Part 39. Abstract Objects. Numbers, sets, and properties might exist as abstract objects outside space and time. The number 7 exists necessarily and eternally, with no spatial location or temporal duration. Mathematical truths are discovered rather than invented, suggesting that mathematical objects have mind-independent existence. This creates a realm of abstract reality that exists beyond the physical world of concrete objects. Abstract objects lack causal powers and spatial temporal location. They cannot cause physical events or be affected by physical processes. Yet they seem to be objects of mathematical knowledge and logical reasoning. This creates puzzles about how we can gain knowledge of causally inert objects and why mathematical knowledge is so useful for understanding the physical world. Platonists embrace abstract objects as genuine constituents of reality. They argue that mathematical truth requires mathematical objects and that science presupposes abstract mathematical structures. Nominalists reject abstract objects and seek to explain mathematics without ontological commitments to numbers, sets, or properties. They develop alternative foundations for mathematics that avoid reference to abstract entities. The debate involves fundamental questions about the relationship between mathematics and reality. If abstract objects exist, then reality extends far beyond the physical world studied by natural science. If they do not exist, then mathematics requires reinterpretation as something other than the study of abstract mathematical structures. The resolution affects our understanding of knowledge, necessity, and the fundamental categories of existence. Part 40. Possible worlds. Possibilities and necessities might be analysed in terms of possible worlds where different things happen. A possible world is a maximal, consistent way things could be. Something is necessary if it is true in all possible worlds, and possible if it is true in at least one possible world. This provides a systematic framework for modal logic and the analysis of modal concepts. Questions arise about the ontological status of possible worlds themselves. Are they abstract objects, concrete universes, or mere useful fictions? David Lewis famously argued that possible worlds are concrete physical realities just as real as the actual world. Others treat them as abstract representations or maximal consistent sets of propositions. Possible world semantics has applications throughout philosophy, including ethics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. Moral properties might be analysed in terms of what is true across possible worlds. Knowledge might require truth in nearby possible worlds where our evidence is the same. Mental content might depend on causal connections across possible worlds. Critics argue that possible worlds analysis is circular or uninformative. Understanding possibility in terms of possible worlds presupposes modal concepts rather than analysing them. Others worry about the ontological costs of vast numbers of possible worlds. The framework remains influential despite these concerns because of its systematicity and theoretical utility across multiple philosophical domains. Part 41. The Principle of Recombination. Anything can coexist with anything else, and anything can exist without anything else, provided no contradiction results. If objects can exist separately, then there is a possible world where they exist together. If properties can be exemplified separately, then there is a possible world where they are co-exemplified. This principle generates vast numbers of possible worlds by recombining elements from the actual world. The principle implies that there are possible worlds containing arbitrary combinations of actual objects and properties. There is a world where dinosaurs coexist with modern humans and advanced technology. There is a world where your childhood pet still lives, but everything else remains the same. These worlds exist as genuine possibilities, even if they are extremely unlikely or practically impossible. Recombination faces limits from essential properties and necessary connections. If some properties are essential to objects, then not all recombinations are possible. If some laws of nature are metaphysically necessary, then some combinations violate modal constraints. The principle must be restricted to avoid generating impossible worlds where contradictions are true. The principle has implications for modal epistemology and the scope of possibility. If recombination is unrestricted, then we can know about possibilities by imaginatively recombining familiar elements. But if recombination has hidden limits, then possibility might extend beyond what we can imagine or conceive. This affects debates about the relationship between conceivability and possibility in modal reasoning. Part 42. Haecceitism and Thisness. Objects have primitive thisness or haecceity beyond all their qualitative properties. Two objects could be exactly alike in every qualitative respect, yet still be numerically distinct individuals. What makes each object the particular object it is cannot be captured by any description of its properties. Thisness is a fundamental aspect of reality that transcends all qualitative differences. Haecceitism implies that identity facts are brute and unanalyzable. There is no explanation for why this object is this object rather than that object. Individual essence involves primitive thisness that makes each thing the unique individual it is. This goes beyond qualitative essence, which concerns what kinds of properties objects can have. The doctrine has implications for personal identity and the nature of individuals. If persons have primitive thisness, then personal identity involves more than psychological or physical continuity. You are the particular person you are because of your individual essence, not just because of your qualitative features. This creates mysteries about how individual essences are determined and whether they can change over time. Critics argue that Haecceitism is unverifiable and explanatorily useless. We can never detect primitive thisness or use it to explain observable phenomena. Anti-Haecceitists prefer bundle theories, where objects are nothing over and above their qualitative properties. The debate involves fundamental questions about whether reality has a purely qualitative structure or includes irreducible facts about numerical identity. Part 43. Grounding and Metaphysical Dependence. Some facts hold in virtue of other facts, creating asymmetric dependence relations that structure reality. The fact that this apple is red might be grounded in facts about its surface microstructure and light-reflecting properties. Grounding relationships explain why things are the way they are by showing which facts are metaphysically fundamental. This creates a hierarchical picture of reality with fundamental facts at the bottom and derivative facts at higher levels. Grounding differs from causation because it involves synchronous metaphysical dependence rather than temporal processes. Mental facts might be grounded in neural facts without being caused by them. Moral facts might be grounded in natural facts about welfare and preferences. These grounding relations hold timelessly rather than involving causal production over time. The notion of grounding promises to illuminate many philosophical problems about reduction, emergence, and levels of reality. If mental properties are grounded in physical properties, this might explain physicalism without requiring strict identity. If normative properties are grounded in natural properties, this might reconcile moral realism with naturalism. Grounding provides a framework for understanding metaphysical dependence without reduction. Critics question whether grounding is a genuine metaphysical relation or merely a useful theoretical posit. Some argue that grounding talk can always be paraphrased away in favour of more basic concepts. Others worry that grounding is too obscure to do serious philosophical work. The debate involves questions about whether metaphysics needs primitive dependence relations or whether everything can be explained using causation, identity, and logical concepts. Part 44. The problem of temporary intrinsics. Objects seem to have incompatible intrinsic properties at different times. A straight stick becomes bent when placed in water, but shape seems to be an intrinsic property. How can the same object be both straight and bent if these are incompatible intrinsic properties? This creates puzzles about how objects can change their intrinsic features while remaining numerically identical. Three-dimensionalists argue that objects are wholly present at each time and genuinely change their intrinsic properties. They propose various solutions, including relativizing properties to times or appealing to different ways of having properties. The stick might be straight at time 1 and bent at time 2 without contradiction. Alternatively, it might have straightness in one way and bentness in another way. Four-dimensionalists solve the problem by denying that objects have incompatible properties. Different temporal parts of the object have different properties, but no single temporal part has incompatible properties. The stick at time 1 is straight, and the stick at time 2 is bent, but these are different objects. Change becomes variation across temporal parts rather than alteration of properties within objects. The problem tests our basic concepts of objects, properties, and time. Solutions must preserve either genuine change or genuine intrinsic properties, but apparently not both. This forces choices about which aspects of our conceptual scheme are most fundamental. The resolution affects broader questions about persistence, identity, and the nature of temporal existence. Part 45. Degrees of existence. Some objects might exist more than others, rather than existence being an all-or-nothing property. Fundamental particles might exist more fully than composite objects, which might exist more than fictional objects. This creates a hierarchy of existence with different degrees or levels of being. Existence becomes a scalar property that admits of gradations rather than a simple binary distinction. Degrees of existence might explain puzzles about disputed objects. Fictional characters exist to some degree, but less than concrete objects. Future contingents exist to some degree, but less than present actualities. Vague objects exist to varying degrees, depending on how determinate their boundaries are. The view faces the challenge of explaining what degrees of existence mean. How do we measure or compare different degrees of being? What makes one object exist more than another object? Critics argue that existence is fundamentally binary and that apparent degrees reflect different properties rather than different amounts of existence. Alternative approaches include treating apparent existence degrees as degrees of determinacy, completeness, or mind independence. Objects might be more or less determinate in their properties without existing more or less. The debate involves fundamental questions about the nature of existence and whether being admits of degrees. It also connects to issues about the relationship between existence and other metaphysical properties like fundamentality and independence. Part 46. Ontological Categories. Reality might be divided into fundamental categories of being that structure all existence. Objects, properties, relations, events and times might represent different categories with distinct identity and persistence conditions. These categories are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, providing a complete taxonomy of everything that exists. Understanding the categorical structure of reality reveals the fundamental nature of being itself. Different philosophical traditions propose different categorical schemes. Aristotle distinguished substances from accidents, with substances being independent existents and accidents depending on substances. Modern philosophy often distinguishes particulars from universals, with particulars being non-repeatable individuals and universals being repeatable properties. Process philosophers emphasize events and becoming rather than static objects and properties. Questions arise about whether categorical distinctions are objective features of reality or merely useful conceptual frameworks. Are there really different kinds of being, or do our concepts impose artificial divisions on a unified reality? Some argue that categorical schemes reflect the structure of thought rather than the structure of being. Others maintain that reality has an objective categorical structure that correct metaphysics must discover. The choice of categorical scheme affects solutions to other metaphysical problems. Different categories have different identity conditions, persistence conditions, and causal powers. Whether we treat minds as substances, properties, or processes affects solutions to the mind-body problem. The categorical framework thus provides the foundation for addressing more specific metaphysical questions about the nature of particular kinds of entities. Part 47. The Metaphysics of Time Travel. If time travel is possible, then the same person could exist at multiple times simultaneously. A time traveler could visit their past self, creating scenarios where one person occupies two different temporal locations. This challenges standard assumptions about identity and persistence through time. How can the same object exist at different times without violating the logic of identity? Time travel scenarios create puzzles about causation and the possibility of changing the past. Could a time traveler prevent their own time travel by altering past events? If the past can be changed, then the same events might both happen and not happen. If the past cannot be changed, then time travelers seem to lack genuine agency in past situations. Different theories of time give different accounts of time travel possibilities. Eternalism treats all times as equally real, making time travel like spatial travel to different locations. Presentism makes time travel impossible because past and future times do not exist to be visited. The growing block theory allows travel to the past, but not to the future. Solutions to time travel paradoxes include branching timelines, consistency constraints, and impossible scenarios. Some argue that time travel creates alternative timelines rather than changing the original timeline. Others maintain that consistency requirements prevent paradoxical scenarios from arising. Still others embrace impossible scenarios as genuine features of time travel worlds. Part 48. Zeno's Paradoxes. Motion seems impossible if space and time are infinitely divisible. To reach a destination, you must first travel half the distance, then half the remaining distance, and so on infinitely. But completing infinitely many tasks seems impossible. suggesting that motion cannot occur. This creates a fundamental tension between mathematical infinity and physical motion. The paradox of Achilles and the tortoise imagines a race where Achilles gives the tortoise a head start. When Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise has moved ahead. When Achilles reaches that new point, the tortoise has moved ahead again. This process continues infinitely, suggesting that Achilles can never catch the tortoise. Modern mathematics resolves the paradoxes using infinite series that converge to finite limits. Infinitely many intervals of space or time can sum to finite totals. But questions remain about whether mathematical solutions address the metaphysical problems. Do infinite series really explain how objects can complete infinitely many tasks? The paradoxes reveal deep issues about the nature of space, time, and infinity. If space and time are continuous, then motion involves completing infinite tasks. If space and time are discrete, then motion involves discrete jumps rather than continuous change. Either option has counterintuitive consequences that challenge our understanding of physical reality. Part 49. The Principle of Sufficient Reason. Everything that exists or happens has a sufficient reason for existing or happening rather than not. Nothing occurs without a complete explanation that accounts for why it occurs rather than some alternative. This principle demands that reality be completely intelligible and free from arbitrary or inexplicable facts. Every fact must be grounded in prior facts that necessitate its truth. The principle leads to strong conclusions about the nature of reality. If everything has a sufficient reason, then there might be a necessary being that explains its own existence. Contingent facts require explanations in terms of other facts, creating chains of dependence that must terminate somewhere. The principle suggests that ultimate reality consists of necessary rather than contingent facts. Critics argue that the principle is too strong and conflicts with quantum mechanics. Quantum events seem to be genuinely random without sufficient reasons for their specific outcomes. Free actions might lack sufficient reasons if they involve genuine choice between alternatives. The principle also faces the challenge of explaining its own truth without circularity. Different versions of the principle make different demands about explanation. Strong versions require necessary and sufficient conditions for every fact. Weak versions only require sufficient reasons for the existence of contingent beings. The principle connects to debates about determinism, explanation, and the ultimate nature of reality. Part 50. Truthmakers and Truthmaking. True propositions require truthmakers in reality that make them true. The proposition that snow is white is true because snow exists and has the property of whiteness. Without appropriate truthmakers, propositions would lack the basis for their truth. This connects truth to reality by requiring that truths correspond to genuine features of the world. Truthmaker theory faces challenges about negative propositions and general propositions. What makes it true that there are no unicorns if truthmakers must exist? What makes it true that all ravens are black if there are infinitely many possible ravens? These cases suggest that not all truths require positive existing truth-makers. Different theories propose different truth-making relations. Some require that truth-makers necessitate their truths, while others allow more flexible connections. Some accept totality states or negative states of affairs as truth-makers for negative truths. Others deny that negative truths need truth-makers and restrict the principle to positive truths. The Truthmaker principle has implications for debates about realism and anti-realism. If moral truths require moral truthmakers, then moral realism might demand moral facts or properties. If mathematical truths require mathematical truthmakers, then Platonism might be required for mathematical realism. The principle thus connects questions about truth to questions about what kinds of things exist. Part 51. The Doctrine of Arbitrary Undetached Parts. Every material object has countless undetached parts that we normally ignore in ordinary thought. Your body contains an object consisting of your left thumbnail, right kneecap, and the tip of your nose. This scattered, undetached part exists just as genuinely as your are accepting billions of such arbitrary parts as genuine objects. These arbitrary parts have bizarre persistence conditions and causal powers. The thumbnail kneecap nose object changes shape when you bend your knee, even though most of its parts remain stationary. It can be partially destroyed by cutting your nail while leaving the rest intact. Such objects challenge our intuitions about which collections of matter deserve to count as unified things. The existence of arbitrary parts follows from unrestricted composition combined with the transitivity of parthood. If any collection composes an object and any subcollection of parts forms a part, then we get countless strange parts. Most lack names because they serve no practical purpose and violate natural boundaries. Yet logical principles of mereology seem to require their existence as genuine features of reality. Some philosophers bite the bullet and accept arbitrary parts as genuine but uninteresting objects. Others restrict mereology to avoid generating objects that lack appropriate unity or organization. The debate involves questions about whether ontology should follow abstract logical principles or respect common-sense judgments about natural objects. It also raises issues about the relationship between formal mereology and the actual structure of material reality. Part 52. Grounding loops and metaphysical coherence. Could facts be grounded in themselves through circular chains of metaphysical dependence? If mental facts are grounded in neural facts and neural facts are grounded in physical facts, could physical facts ultimately be grounded in mental facts? This would create a grounding loop where each fact depends on others in a circular pattern. Such loops challenge the assumption that grounding relations must be well-founded with ultimate foundations. Grounding loops might explain mysterious connections between different levels of reality. The mental and physical realms could be mutually dependent rather than one being more fundamental than the other. This would avoid reductionism while maintaining systematic connections between different types of facts. Neither level would be completely independent or completely reducible to the other. Critics argue that grounding loops are impossible because grounding is essentially asymmetric. Nothing can be grounded in itself, even through intermediate steps, because this would make facts depend on themselves. This seems to violate the nature of metaphysical dependence and explanation. Well-founded grounding requires ultimate facts that are not grounded in anything else. The debate has implications for reductionism, emergence, and levels of reality. If grounding loops are possible, then reality might lack fundamental levels, and instead consist of mutually supporting levels. If grounding loops are impossible, then some facts must be metaphysically fundamental and independent. This affects questions about whether physical science describes the most basic level of reality or merely one level among many. Part 53. The Metaphysics of Indeterminate Identity. Some identity relations might be indeterminate rather than definitely true or false. Consider a ship that has had many parts replaced over time. It might be indeterminate whether the current ship is identical to the original ship rather than definitely identical or definitely distinct. This suggests that identity itself can admit of degrees or be genuinely vague. Indeterminate identity challenges classical logic, which requires that identity statements are either true or false. If it is indeterminate whether A equals B, then neither the identity nor the non-identity is definitely true. This might require three-valued logic or other non-classical systems to handle indeterminate cases. Alternatively, it might show that vagueness is merely epistemic rather than metaphysical. The possibility of indeterminate identity has implications for personal identity and survival. It might be indeterminate whether you survive certain medical procedures that alter your brain or body. Rather than definitely surviving or definitely not surviving, there might be cases where survival is genuinely indeterminate. This creates puzzles about decision-making and moral responsibility in borderline cases. Because identity is too fundamental to be vague. Others embrace it as a solution to puzzle cases involving gradual change and borderline examples. The debate involves deep questions about the nature of identity, vagueness, and the structure of reality. It also connects to broader issues about whether the world has a completely determinate structure or contains irreducible indeterminacy. Part 54. The problem of coincident objects. Can two distinct objects occupy exactly the same space at exactly the same time? A bronze statue and the piece of bronze that constitutes it seem to be in the same location simultaneously. But they have different properties. The statue was created yesterday while the bronze existed for months. This suggests they are distinct objects that somehow coincide spatially and temporally. If coincident objects are possible, then spatial location does not determine numerical identity. Multiple objects can share the same spatio-temporal region without being identical. This conflicts with common assumptions about the relationship between objects and the space they occupy. It also raises questions about how many objects exist in any given region of space. Alternative solutions include denying that statues and bronze pieces are genuinely distinct objects. Perhaps they are the same object described in different ways or considered under different concepts. Another approach denies that composition ever occurs, eliminating composite objects like statues entirely. Still another approach accepts coincidence as a genuine but unusual feature of material constitution. The problem extends beyond statues to bodies and organisms, artifacts and raw materials, and other cases of constitution. Your body and the collection of cells that compose it might be distinct coincident objects. The resolution affects fundamental questions about persistence, identity, and the relationship between objects and matter. It also connects to issues about counting objects and determining how many things exist in the world. Part 55. Structural universals. Complex properties might themselves have internal structure composed of simpler universal properties. The property of being methane might be composed of the properties of being carbon and being hydrogen arranged in a specific structural pattern. This makes some universals complex entities built from other universals rather than simple indivisible properties. The structure of complex universals mirrors the structure of the objects that exemplify them. Structural universals promise to explain the internal complexity of properties without reducing them to sets or classes. Water is not just anything with the chemical formula H2O, but rather anything that exemplifies the structural universal built from hydrogen and oxygen universals. This preserves the reality of properties while acknowledging their internal articulation. Complex properties have genuine parts that correspond to the parts of complex objects. The theory faces questions about the composition principles for universals. When do simpler universals combine to form complex structural universals? What determines the specific structural arrangements that create new complex properties? The answers might parallel principles governing the composition of concrete objects or follow different rules specific to abstract universals. Structural universals affect debates about natural kinds, laws of nature, and scientific explanation. If chemical properties are structural universals, then chemistry studies the composition and arrangement of property parts. Natural laws might connect structural universals based on their internal composition. This creates a more fine-grained picture of properties that aligns with scientific practice while maintaining realistic commitments about universal properties. Part 56. The Metaphysics of Emergence. Some properties of wholes are not reducible to properties of parts, even though they depend on those parts. Consciousness might emerge from neural activity without being identical to any specific pattern of neural firing. This creates genuine novelty at higher levels of organization that cannot be predicted from lower-level facts alone. Emergent properties have autonomous causal powers that supplement the causal powers of their underlying parts. Strong emergence differs from weak emergence in involving genuine irreducibility. Weakly emergent properties are reducible in principle even if difficult to predict in practice. Strongly emergent properties cannot be reduced to underlying properties even with perfect knowledge and unlimited computational resources. This creates downward causation, where higher-level properties influence lower-level processes. Emergence faces the challenge of explaining how genuinely novel properties can arise from purely physical processes. If emergence is genuine, it seems to violate the causal closure of physics by introducing new causal powers. If emergence is not genuine, then apparent emergent properties must be reducible to underlying physical properties. This creates tensions between scientific reductionism and the apparent autonomy of higher-level phenomena. Different theories propose different mechanisms for emergence, including non-linear dynamics, quantum effects, and organizational complexity. Some appeal to chaos theory and complex systems to explain how simple rules can generate unpredictable behavior. Others invoke quantum mechanics to allow for genuine novelty at macroscopic scales. The debate involves fundamental questions about levels of reality and the relationship between different sciences. Part 57. Ontological dependence relations. Some objects depend for their existence on other objects in various ways that structure reality hierarchically. A smile depends on a face, a shadow depends on an object and light source, and a musical performance depends on musicians and instruments. These dependence relations are not causal, but rather constitutive connections that determine what can exist. Understanding dependence reveals the fundamental architecture of reality and the relationships between different types of entities. Different types of dependence include generic dependence, where objects depend on the existence of certain types of objects. Minds might generically depend on brains without depending on any specific brain. Rigid dependence involves dependence on specific individual objects that cannot be replaced by other objects of the same type. A particular shadow rigidly depends on the specific object that casts it. Dependence relations affect persistence conditions and modal properties of dependent objects. If an object depends on another object, then it cannot exist in possible worlds where that object does not exist. Changes to independent objects might necessarily involve changes to dependent objects. This creates systematic connections between different levels of reality that constrain possible combinations of existence and non-existence. The study of dependence illuminates debates about reduction, grounding, and fundamentality. Objects that depend on others are less fundamental than the objects they depend on. This creates hierarchies of fundamentality that might terminate in absolutely independent objects. Understanding these hierarchies reveals which objects are metaphysically basic and which are derivative or constructed from more fundamental entities. Part 58. The Metaphysics of Powers. Objects might have intrinsic powers or dispositions that determine how they behave in various circumstances. Salt has the power to dissolve in water, glass has the power to break when struck, and magnets have the power to attract iron. These powers exist even when not manifested and explain why objects behave as they do when the right conditions arise. Powers provide an alternative to Humean accounts that treat regularities as mere coincidences without underlying necessities. Powers are intrinsic properties that essentially involve relations to possible manifestations. The power of solubility is essentially the power to dissolve under certain conditions. This makes powers irreducibly modal properties that involve counterfactual conditionals about what would happen in various circumstances. Powers thus build modality into the fundamental nature of objects rather than treating it as a merely logical or epistemic phenomenon. The theory faces questions about the relationship between powers and their categorical bases. Does solubility exist over and above the molecular structure that grounds it, or is it identical to that structure? Some defend pure powers theories where powers have no categorical bases, while others require mixed theories with both powerful and categorical properties. Still others argue that the distinction between powers and categorical properties is merely conceptual rather than metaphysical. Powers theories affect debates about causation, laws of nature, and scientific explanation. Causation might consist in the manifestation of powers when appropriate stimulus conditions are present. Laws of nature might describe the exercise of powers where objects are inherently active rather than merely passive recipients of external forces. Part 59. Instantaneous versus extended events. Are events like explosions, instantaneous occurrences, or temporally extended processes? An explosion might be a complex extended event involving ignition, expansion, and aftermath phases over time. Alternatively, it might be an instantaneous transition between different states with no temporal duration. This affects how we understand change, causation, and the temporal structure of processes. Instantaneous events avoid the problem of explaining how events can have temporal parts. If events are instantaneous, then they are temporally simple and do not need to be composed of earlier and later temporal parts. But this makes it mysterious how instantaneous events can account for apparently extended processes like growth or decay. Extended events better capture the temporal complexity of processes, but face questions about their internal temporal structure. Different theories of events give different accounts of temporal extension. Some treat events as classes of tropes or property instances that can be scattered across time. Others view events as changes in objects or transitions between different property instantiations. Still others identify events with facts or states of affairs that can be temporally located but not extended. The debate connects to issues about the nature of time, change and processes in physics. Quantum mechanics suggests that some physical events might be genuinely instantaneous quantum jumps. Relativity theory complicates questions about the temporal extension of events by making simultaneity relative to reference frames. The resolution affects how we understand the relationship between the manifest image of temporal processes and the scientific image of physical events. Part 60. The Unity of Consciousness. How can consciousness be unified if it is implemented by billions of separate neurons? Your visual experience of a red ball combines information about color, shape and motion into a single, unified perceptual experience. But different aspects are processed by different brain regions with no central location where they come together. This creates the binding problem of explaining how distributed processing produces unified conscious experience. The unity of consciousness suggests that conscious experiences cannot be decomposed into separate independent components. You do not have separate visual, auditory and tactile consciousnesses that somehow combine. Instead, you have a single unified consciousness that includes all these different aspects as integrated components. This unity seems to require some mechanism that integrates information across different processing systems. Different theories propose different solutions to the unity problem. Some appeal to temporal synchronization of neural oscillations that bind different processing streams together. Others invoke global workspace theories where information becomes conscious by being broadcast to multiple brain systems. Still others argue that unity is a fundamental feature of consciousness that cannot be explained by neural mechanisms. The unity of consciousness has implications for personal identity and the boundaries of the self. If consciousness is unified, then there might be clear boundaries between different conscious subjects. But if unity can break down, as in certain psychiatric conditions, then personal identity itself might be fragmented. This affects questions about responsibility, survival, and the nature of persons as unified conscious agents. Part 61. Mereological Essentialism. Objects essentially have the parts they actually have and cannot survive any change in their material composition. If Mereological Essentialism is true, then you could not survive losing a single atom from your body. Any change in parts would destroy the original object and create a new object with different parts. This makes objects extremely fragile and short-lived in the face of constant material turnover. The doctrine implies that ordinary objects like tables and chairs are constantly being destroyed and replaced by new objects. When a table loses a splinter, the original table ceases to exist, and a new table with slightly different parts comes into existence. This makes persistence extremely rare and identity over time nearly impossible for composite objects. Only fundamental particles that lack proper parts could maintain their identity through time. Mereological essentialism conflicts with common-sense views about persistence and survival. We normally think that people, animals and artifacts can survive significant changes in their material composition. The doctrine suggests that these common-sense judgments are systematically mistaken about the persistence conditions of familiar objects. What we call persistence is really a series of rapid replacements by similar but distinct objects. Defenders argue that mereological essentialism provides precise and principled answers to puzzle cases about composition and persistence. It eliminates vagueness about persistence conditions by making all compositional changes identity-destroying. Critics argue that it conflicts too severely with ordinary judgments and scientific practice to be plausible. The debate involves questions about whether metaphysics should respect common sense or follow theoretical principles regardless of counterintuitive consequences. Part 62. The Metaphysics of Social Objects. Social institutions like money, marriage, and governments seem to exist but lack clear physical boundaries. A dollar bill is a piece of paper, but money itself is not identical to any physical object. Social objects depend on collective human attitudes and practices for their existence and properties. This creates a special category of reality that is neither purely physical nor purely mental, but somehow social. Social objects often have constitutive rules that determine their essential features. Money essentially involves accepted mediums of exchange, while games essentially involve systems of rules that define winning and losing. These rules are not laws of nature, but conventional agreements that create new types of entities with special properties. Social reality thus involves a kind of collective intentionality that brings new objects into existence through shared recognition. Questions arise about the ontological status of social objects compared to physical and mental objects. Are social institutions genuinely real or merely useful fictions that supervene on individual mental states? If they are real, do they have causal powers that supplement the causal powers of individuals? Social objects might influence behavior in ways that cannot be reduced to individual psychology or physical interactions. The metaphysics of social objects affects political philosophy, economics and social science. If institutions are real, then they might have moral standing and causal efficacy that constrains individual action. If they are mere constructions, then social science might reduce to individual psychology plus physical interactions. Understanding social reality requires clarifying the relationship between collective phenomena and individual mental states. Part 63. Contingent Existence. Some objects exist but could have failed to exist under different circumstances. You exist but might never have existed if your parents had never met. This contingent existence contrasts with necessary existence, where objects exist in all possible worlds. Contingent objects depend on specific causal histories and circumstances that might not have occurred. Contingent existence raises questions about the modal properties of objects and their essential features. If you could have failed to exist, then existence is not one of your essential properties. This suggests that essential properties are only those properties you have in every possible world where you exist. Existence itself becomes an accidental rather than essential feature of contingent objects. The doctrine affects debates about personal identity and the significance of possible worlds. If you are contingently existing, then there are possible worlds that are exactly like the actual world except for your non-existence. Your impact on the world is limited to differences between worlds where you exist and similar worlds where you do not. This might affect questions about the meaning and significance of individual existence. Some philosophers argue that contingent existence is impossible because objects cannot have properties in worlds where they do not exist. Others defend contingent existence as a genuine feature of most ordinary objects. The debate involves complex questions about trans-world identity and the relationship between existence and essential properties. It also connects to theological questions about whether anything exists necessarily and what kinds of beings could have necessary existence. Part 64. The Problem of Material Constitution. When a statue is made from clay, do we have one object or two objects sharing the same location? The statue and the clay seem to have different persistence conditions and modal properties. The clay existed before being shaped and could survive being reshaped, while the statue began existing when shaped and would be destroyed by reshaping. This suggests they are distinct objects that happen to coincide spatially and temporally. Where the statue depends on the clay, but not vice versa. The clay could exist without constituting any statue, but the statue cannot exist. This creates a special relation between objects that is weaker than identity but stronger than mere spatial coincidence. Constitution might be a fundamental metaphysical relation that structures the material world. Alternative approaches deny that constitution creates two distinct objects. Some argue that the statue and clay are identical objects considered under different concepts or descriptions. Others maintain that only one object really exists, with statue and clay being different ways of referring to the same thing. Still others deny that composite objects like statues exist at all, accepting only fundamental particles arranged in statue-like patterns. The problem generalizes to many cases involving objects and the matter that makes them up. Bodies and organisms, artifacts and raw materials, and even persons and their physical substrates might involve similar constitution relations. The resolution affects fundamental questions about counting objects and understanding the relationship between different levels of material organization. It also impacts debates about persistence, identity, and the metaphysics of everyday objects. Part 65. Non-Existent Objects. Could there be objects that do not exist, such as merely possible objects or fictional characters? Sherlock Holmes seems to be an object that has properties like being a detective and living on Baker Street. But Holmes does not exist in the actual world, raising questions about the ontological status of non-existent objects. This challenges the principle that everything that has properties must exist in order to have those properties. Meinongian theories embrace non-existent objects as genuine objects that lack the property of existence. Holmes is a non-existent detective who genuinely has the property of being a detective while lacking the property of existing. This creates a broad domain of objects that includes both existent and non-existent objects as equally genuine objects. Existence becomes just one property among others rather than a precondition for having any properties at all. Critics argue that non-existent objects are contradictory because having properties requires existence. If Holmes does not exist, then there is no object to have the property of being a detective. Apparent reference to non-existent objects must be explained without postulating non-existent objects as genuine reference. Alternative theories appeal to pretense, abstract objects, or paraphrase to avoid commitment to non-existent objects. The debate has implications for logic, semantics, and the scope of quantification. If non-existent objects are possible, then logic might need to distinguish existence predicates from other predicates. If they are impossible, then meaningful discourse about fictional and merely possible objects requires special explanation. The resolution affects fundamental questions about the relationship between thought, language, and reality. Part 66. Temporal Becoming and the Moving Spotlight. Time might involve genuine becoming where the present moment moves through a static series of events. The moving spotlight theory suggests that events are arranged in a temporal series, but only present events are illuminated by the spotlight of nowness. As time passes, the spotlight moves to illuminate different events, making them present in succession. This combines the objective reality of temporal becoming with the equal reality of past and future events. The moving spotlight faces questions about what drives the motion of nowness through time. If the spotlight moves at 1 second per second, this seems to require a higher-level temporal dimension to measure the rate of movement. If it moves without a rate, then the notion of temporal becoming becomes mysterious. The theory must explain genuine temporal transition without falling into infinite regress of temporal dimensions. Alternative theories either deny genuine becoming or deny the equal reality of all times. Eternalism treats all times as equally real but denies genuine temporal becoming or passage. Presentism accepts genuine becoming but denies the reality of non-present times. The moving spotlight attempts to have both genuine becoming and the reality of all times, but critics argue this combination is unstable. The debate connects to physics, consciousness, and the nature of temporal experience. Relativity theory challenges objective simultaneity, which seems required for a universal moving spotlight. Conscious experience involves apparent temporal becoming that might require genuine passage of time. The resolution affects whether our temporal experience reveals genuine features of reality or involves systematic illusions about the nature of time. Part 67. Strong versus weak emergence. Emergent properties might be genuinely novel additions to reality or merely surprising consequences of underlying properties. Strong emergence involves irreducible properties that cannot be predicted or explained from lower-level facts, even in principle. Weak emergence involves properties that are reducible in principle but difficult to predict or explain in practice. This distinction determines whether emergence creates genuine novelty or merely epistemic surprise. Strongly emergent properties seem to violate the causal closure of physics by introducing new causal powers. If consciousness strongly emerges from neural activity, then it has causal powers that supplement purely physical causation. This suggests that physical laws are incomplete and that higher-level properties can influence lower-level processes. Strong emergence thus threatens reductive physicalism and the unity of science. Weakly emergent properties preserve causal closure while acknowledging practical limitations on prediction and explanation. Complex systems can exhibit surprising behavior that cannot be predicted without detailed simulation. But this unpredictability reflects computational limitations rather than genuine irreducibility. Given sufficient knowledge and computational power, weakly emergent properties could be fully explained in terms of underlying properties. The distinction affects debates about consciousness, life, and social phenomena. If mental properties are strongly emergent, then physicalism is false and dualism might be true. If they are weakly emergent, then physicalism could be preserved while acknowledging the practical autonomy of psychological explanation. The resolution determines whether different sciences study genuinely different levels of reality or merely different aspects of the same underlying physical reality. Part 68. The Metaphysics of Laws of Nature. Are laws of nature fundamental features of reality or mere regularities in the behavior of objects? The law of gravity might be a genuine constraint that governs how massive objects behave, or it might just describe a pattern in their actual behavior. This affects whether laws explain events or merely summarize them in a convenient way. Different theories of laws have different implications for modality, causation, and scientific explanation. Regularity theories treat laws as universal generalizations that happen to be true without imposing genuine necessities. It is a law that all ravens are black if all ravens just happen to be black without any deeper necessity. This makes laws contingent features of the actual world rather than necessary constraints on possible worlds. Laws become descriptions of cosmic coincidences rather than explanations of why events occur. Necessitarian theories treat laws as metaphysically necessary connections between properties or universals. It is a law that mass attracts mass because the property of having mass is necessarily connected to gravitational attraction. This makes laws hold in all possible worlds and explains why actual regularities are not merely accidental. Laws govern events by imposing necessary constraints based on the essential natures of properties. Powers theories ground laws in the intrinsic dispositions of objects rather than external constraints or regularities. Massive objects attract because they have intrinsic powers of gravitational attraction. Laws describe how these powers manifest when appropriate conditions are present. This makes laws dependent on the natures of objects rather than independent features that govern object behavior from outside. Part 69. The Metaphysics of Kinds. Natural kinds like water, gold, and tigers might be genuine features of reality rather than human classifications. These kinds are discovered by science rather than invented by human interests or conceptual schemes. They reflect objective similarities and differences that exist independently of how we happen to classify objects. Natural kinds provide the basis for scientific laws, predictions, and explanations that track real patterns in nature. Essential properties determine membership in natural kinds and explain why kind members behave similarly. Water essentially has the chemical structure H2O, which explains why all water samples have similar properties like freezing at 0 degrees Celsius. These essential properties are discovered through scientific investigation rather than stipulated by definition. Natural kinds thus have objective boundaries determined by nature rather than arbitrary human decisions. Questions arise about the relationship between natural kinds and properties, universals, or classes. Are kinds identical to certain properties, or do they have properties without being identical to them? Do kinds exist as abstract universals that are exemplified by their members, or are they concrete objects that somehow contain their members? Different metaphysical frameworks provide different accounts of the ontological status of kinds and their relationship to their members. The debate affects issues about scientific realism, essentialism, and the objectivity of classification. If natural kinds are real, then science discovers objective features of reality rather than imposing human categories on nature. If they are mere constructions, then scientific classification reflects human interests rather than natural boundaries. The resolution determines whether taxonomy and classification have objective truth conditions or are merely conventional schemes for organizing experience. Part 70. Ontological Pluralism. Different types of objects might exist in different ways rather than all existing in the same uniform manner. Numbers exist mathematically, physical objects exist spatiotemporally, and fictional characters exist in stories. These represent different modes or ways of being rather than different degrees of existence. Ontological pluralism rejects the assumption that existence is univocal across all domains of objects. Different modes of existence might have different logic and different persistence conditions. Mathematical existence might be necessary and atemporal, while physical existence is contingent and temporal. Fictional existence might depend on narrative contexts. in ways that mathematical and physical existence do not. Each mode creates its own domain with distinctive features that cannot be reduced to other modes. Pluralism faces questions about what unifies different modes of existence and how they relate to each other. Is there a generic notion of existence that applies across all modes, or are the modes completely distinct? Can objects transition between different modes of existence, or are they essentially tied to particular modes? The theory must explain both the diversity of existence modes and whatever unity exists across different domains. Critics argue that ontological pluralism multiplies entities beyond necessity and creates artificial distinctions. They prefer univocal theories where existence means the same thing across all domains. Defenders argue that pluralism better respects the diversity of objects and avoids forced reductions that distort the nature of different domains. The debate involves fundamental questions about the unity of ontology and whether existence has a single nature or multiple natures. Part 71. The Metaphysics of Persistence. Do objects persist by being wholly present at each moment, or by having temporal parts at different times? Endurantism claims that objects are wholly present whenever they exist, while Perdurantism claims they have different temporal parts at different times. This affects how we understand change, identity, and survival through time. Different theories of persistence give different answers to puzzles about temporal existence and modal properties. Endurantism faces the problem of temporary intrinsics where objects seem to have incompatible properties at different times. A stick cannot be both straight and bent if these are incompatible intrinsic properties. Endurantists must relativize properties to times, deny that shapes are intrinsic, or invoke different ways of having properties. These solutions attempt to preserve genuine change while maintaining the whole presence of objects at each time. Perdurantism avoids temporary intrinsics by making different temporal parts have different properties. The straight temporal part and the bent temporal part are different objects with compatible properties. But Perdurantism faces questions about what unifies temporal parts into persisting objects. Why do your childhood and adult temporal parts count as parts of the same four-dimensional object rather than separate objects? The debate connects to issues about the nature of time, properties, and modal logic. Different theories of time favor different accounts of persistence. The resolution affects how we understand personal identity, moral responsibility, and survival through change. It also impacts the interpretation of physics, where objects are often treated as four-dimensional entities in space-time rather than three-dimensional entities in space. Part 72. Primitive Thisness. Each individual object might have a primitive thisness that makes it the particular object it is beyond all its properties. This thisness cannot be analyzed in terms of qualitative features or reduced to anything more basic. Two objects could share all the same properties while remaining numerically distinct due to their different primitive thisnesses. Individual identity involves something over and above qualitative identity that grounds facts about numerical distinctness. Primitive thisness creates puzzles about identification and reference across possible worlds. If thisness cannot be captured by qualitative descriptions, how can we identify the same individual in different possible worlds? What makes it true that someone in another possible world is you rather than someone else with exactly similar properties? Primitive thisness seems to require brute facts about transworld identity that cannot be explained or verified. The doctrine has implications for personal identity and the nature of individuals. If persons have primitive thisness, then personal identity involves more than psychological or physical continuity. You are essentially the particular individual you are in ways that go beyond all qualitative features. This might ground intuitions about the irreplaceable value of individuals and the importance of numerical identity distinct from qualitative similarity. Critics argue that primitive thisness is unverifiable and explanatorily idle. We can never detect thisness or use it to explain observable phenomena. Anti-Haecceitists prefer bundle theories, where individuals are constituted by their qualitative properties rather than possessing primitive thisness. The debate involves fundamental questions about whether reality has a purely qualitative structure or includes irreducible facts about numerical identity. Part 73. The Metaphysics of Absences. Negative facts about what is absent or does not exist might require special metaphysical treatment. The fact that there are no unicorns seems to be a genuine fact about reality. But negative facts are not grounded in existing entities in the way that positive facts are grounded in existing objects and properties. This creates puzzles about the truthmakers for negative propositions and the ontological status of absences. Some philosophers postulate negative states of affairs or totality facts as truthmakers for negative truths. The negative state of affairs of there being no unicorns makes it true that unicorns do not exist. Totality facts state that certain positive facts are all the facts of relevant types. These approaches populate ontology with additional entities to ground negative truths. Others argue that negative truths do not require truthmakers because truth does not always require grounding in reality. The absence of unicorns is not a feature of reality, but rather a lack of features. Negative truths are made true by the failure of corresponding positive truths to be made true. This approach avoids multiplying entities while explaining the truth conditions of negative propositions. The problem extends to other types of absences, including holes, shadows, and missing objects. Do these absences exist as genuine features of reality, or are they merely ways of describing how positive entities are arranged? The resolution affects broader questions about the relationship between truth and reality. It also connects to issues about quantification, existence claims, and the scope of our ontological commitments. Part 74. Degrees of being. Reality might be stratified into different levels, with some entities being more real or fundamental than others. Physical particles might be more real than composite objects, which might be more real than fictional characters. This creates a hierarchy of reality rather than a simple distinction between existence and non-existence. Degrees of being replace binary existence with scalar reality that admits of more and less. Different criteria for degrees of being include causal efficacy, independence, and fundamentality. Entities with greater causal powers might be more real than causally inert entities. Independent entities might be more real than dependent entities that exist only relative to other things. Fundamental entities might be more real than derivative entities that are constructed from more basic components. Degrees of being affect debates about scientific realism and the status of theoretical entities. Electrons might be more real than biological species, which might be more real than economic institutions. This could ground a layered view of science where different sciences study entities with different degrees of reality. Physics studies the most real entities, while social sciences study entities with attenuated reality. Critics argue that being is fundamentally binary and that apparent degrees reflect different properties rather than different amounts of existence. Something either exists or does not exist, and existing things can have different properties without existing more or less. Defenders argue that degrees of being better capture the diversity of entities and their different relationships to fundamental reality. The debate involves fundamental questions about the nature of existence and whether reality has a uniform structure or stratified levels. Part 75. The Metaphysics of Constitution. Some objects are constituted by other objects without being identical to them. A statue is constituted by clay, but the statue and clay have different persistence conditions and modal properties. Constitution creates asymmetric dependence where the statue depends on the clay but not vice versa. This generates puzzles about the relationship between objects and the matter that makes them up. Constitution differs from composition because constituted objects seem to be distinct from their constituent matter. The clay existed before becoming a statue and could survive being reshaped, while the statue would be destroyed by reshaping. This suggests that constitution creates new objects rather than merely rearranging existing parts. Constitutional relations might be fundamental metaphysical relations that structure the material world. Different theories propose different accounts of the constitution relation. Some treat constitution as a special case of composition with additional temporal or modal constraints. Others argue that constitution involves distinct objects that share the same matter at the same time. Still, others deny that constitution occurs and argue that apparent cases involve identity under different descriptions. The problem affects debates about counting objects and understanding material existence. If constitution creates distinct objects, then any region of matter might contain multiple coincident objects. If constitution reduces to identity or composition, then apparent constituted objects are not genuinely distinct. The resolution determines how many objects exist and what kinds of relationships can hold between objects and matter. Part 76. Metaphysical Naturalism. All genuine facts might be natural facts discoverable by empirical science. Metaphysical naturalism denies supernatural facts while maintaining that metaphysics studies the most general features of natural reality. This constrains metaphysical theorizing to respect scientific discoveries about the natural world. Naturalistic metaphysics seeks to understand reality within the framework provided by natural science. Different versions of naturalism make different claims about the relationship between metaphysics and science. Strong naturalism argues that metaphysics should be replaced by or reduced to natural science. Weak naturalism maintains that metaphysics is autonomous, but must be consistent with scientific findings. Liberal naturalism allows metaphysics to go beyond science, while remaining naturalistic in spirit and method. Naturalism faces questions about the status of abstract objects, consciousness and normative facts. Mathematical objects seem to exist necessarily and timelessly in ways that conflict with naturalistic constraints. Conscious experience involves subjective features that might not be captured by objective scientific methods. Moral and epistemic norms seem to involve facts that go beyond purely descriptive natural facts. The debate affects the methodology and scope of metaphysical inquiry. If naturalism is correct, then metaphysics must respect scientific constraints and avoid supernatural commitments. If naturalism is too restrictive, then metaphysics might need to go beyond natural science to address fundamental questions about reality. The resolution determines whether metaphysics is continuous with science or involves distinctive methods and subject matter. Part 77. The Metaphysics of Dispositions. Objects might have intrinsic dispositions that determine their behavior in various circumstances. Fragility is the disposition to break when struck, solubility is the disposition to dissolve in water, and elasticity is the disposition to return to original shape when deformed. These dispositions exist even when not manifested, and explain counterfactual truths about how objects would behave. Dispositions ground laws of nature and causal powers in the intrinsic natures of objects. Dispositions create puzzles about their relationship to their categorical bases and manifestations. Is fragility identical to the molecular structure that grounds it, or is it a distinct property that depends on that structure? Do unmanifested dispositions really exist, or do they only exist when actually manifested? These questions affect whether dispositions are fundamental features of reality or reducible to other properties. Pure dispositionalism argues that all fundamental properties are dispositional rather than categorical. Objects are nothing but clusters of dispositions to behave in various ways under different conditions. This eliminates categorical properties entirely and grounds all of reality in dynamic powers and potentials. Mixed theories combine dispositional and categorical properties as equally fundamental aspects of objects. The theory affects debates about laws, causation, and the fundamental nature of matter. If objects have intrinsic dispositions, then laws might describe the exercise of these dispositions rather than external constraints. Causation might consist in the manifestation of dispositions when appropriate trigger conditions are present. This creates a more dynamic picture of nature where objects are inherently active rather than passive recipients of external forces. Part 78. Thick versus thin concepts of properties. Properties might be thick substantial entities or thin ways objects are rather than robust additions to being. Thick concepts treat properties as genuine constituents of reality that make real contributions to the nature of objects. Thin concepts treat properties as mere abstractions or ways of talking about how objects are without adding to the furniture of reality. This affects debates about whether properties are discovered or constructed and whether they have substantial ontological status. Thick properties face questions about how they relate to objects and whether they can exist uninstantiated. Do properties inhere in objects, characterize objects from the outside, or somehow constitute objects? Can the property of redness exist, even if nothing red exists? Or do properties depend essentially on being instantiated? These questions affect whether properties are independent abstract entities or dependent aspects of concrete objects. Thin properties avoid these problems by treating property talk as a useful way of describing objects without additional ontological commitments. To say that an object has redness is just to say that it is red, not to postulate an additional entity called redness. Property discourse provides convenient ways of generalizing and systematizing without requiring belief in property entities. This eliminates properties as genuine constituents of reality while preserving their utility in thought and language. The debate affects broader questions about realism, nominalism, and the relationship between language and reality. Thick concepts support realistic attitudes toward properties and their role in scientific explanation. Thin concepts support nominalistic attitudes that avoid multiplication of abstract entities. The resolution determines whether properties deserve inclusion in our ontological inventory or should be eliminated in favor of more basic entities. Part 79. The Metaphysics of Processes. Reality might fundamentally consist of processes rather than static objects with properties. Process metaphysics treats becoming, change, and activity as more fundamental than being, stasis, and substance. Objects become secondary abstractions from underlying processes rather than primary entities that happen to change. This reverses traditional priorities and makes dynamism more basic than stability in the structure of reality. Processes have distinctive identity conditions that differ from object identity. A process continues as long as the same type of activity is occurring, even if the matter involved completely changes. A river is the same process whether it contains the same water molecules or completely different ones. Process identity thus depends on continuity of pattern or activity rather than continuity of substance or matter. Process theories face questions about what makes processes discrete individuals rather than arbitrary segments of continuous becoming. How do we individuate distinct processes and determine their boundaries in the continuous flux of activity? What unifies different temporal stages of the same process and distinguishes them from stages of different processes? These questions parallel problems about object identity, but arise in the context of dynamic rather than static metaphysics. The approach affects debates about mind, life, and social reality. Mental life might be fundamentally processual rather than involving mental objects with properties. Living organisms might be self-organizing processes rather than material objects with biological properties. Social institutions might be ongoing processes of interaction rather than abstract objects with social properties. Part 80. Metaphysical Anti-Realism. The world might lack determinate structure independent of our conceptual schemes and practices. Anti-realism denies that reality has an objective nature that determines unique correct descriptions. Instead, different conceptual frameworks create different ways of organizing experience without corresponding to objective features of reality. Truth becomes relative to frameworks rather than involving objective correspondence to mind-independent facts. Different versions of anti-realism focus on different aspects of alleged mind dependence. Conceptual anti-realism emphasizes the role of concepts in structuring experience and thought. Linguistic anti-realism focuses on how language shapes our understanding of reality. Social anti-realism highlights the collective and conventional aspects of knowledge and truth. Anti-realism faces the challenge of explaining the apparent objectivity and constraint in our experience of the world. Why do some descriptions seem forced on us while others seem arbitrary if reality lacks determinate structure? Why do different investigators converge on similar descriptions if truth is relative to conceptual schemes? Anti-realists must explain apparent objectivity without appealing to objective, mind-independent reality. The debate affects the interpretation of science, mathematics, and ordinary experience. If anti-realism is correct, then scientific theories create rather than discover the structure they describe. Mathematical truths reflect conventional decisions rather than objective mathematical facts. The resolution determines whether inquiry aims at discovering objective truth or constructing useful ways of organizing experience. Part 81. The Problem of Change. How can objects genuinely change while remaining numerically identical through time? If an object is different after change, then it seems not to be the same object that existed before change. But if it is the same object, then it seems not to have genuinely changed. This creates a fundamental tension between identity and alteration that challenges our understanding of temporal existence. Different theories of change propose different solutions to this ancient puzzle. Some argue that objects have properties relative to times, so the same object can be tall at time 1 and short at time 2. Others invoke different ways of having properties that allow compatible possession of incompatible properties. Still others deny that objects persist through change and argue that apparent persistence involves replacement by similar objects. Four-dimensional approaches dissolve the problem by treating change as variation across temporal dimensions. Different temporal parts of objects have different properties, but no single temporal part has incompatible properties. Change becomes like spatial variation where different spatial parts have different properties. This preserves both identity and difference by distributing them across the temporal dimension rather than locating them in conflict. The problem connects to broader issues about time, identity, and the nature of properties. Solutions must preserve either genuine change or strict identity, but apparently not both together. This forces choices about which aspects of our conceptual scheme are most fundamental to preserve. The resolution affects debates about persistence, causation, and the relationship between objects and time. Part 82. Ontological Commitment. What determines which entities a theory is committed to accepting as real? Quine argued that we are committed to the entities that must exist for our best theories to be true. This makes ontological commitment a matter of the quantificational structure of our theories rather than explicit claims about existence. Different formulations of the same theory might have different ontological commitments despite being empirically equivalent. The criterion of ontological commitment affects debates about abstract objects, theoretical entities, and disputed objects. If mathematical theories quantify over numbers, then accepting those theories commits us to believing that numbers exist. If scientific theories quantify over forces or fields, then accepting those theories commits us to believing in forces or fields. This makes the evaluation of theories partially a matter of their ontological costs, rather than just their empirical accuracy. Alternative approaches to ontological commitment include explicit existence claims, practical indispensability, and explanatory role. Some argue that only explicit existence claims create genuine ontological commitments. Others focus on which entities are practically indispensable for achieving theoretical goals. Still, others emphasize which entities play essential explanatory roles in our best theories of natural phenomena. The debate affects the methodology of metaphysics and the relationship between theoretical and ontological questions. If ontological commitment is determined by quantification, then paraphrasing theories can change their ontological implications. If commitment depends on explanatory role, then the same entities might be acceptable in some theoretical contexts, but not others. The resolution determines how theoretical choices affect our beliefs about what exists and what kinds of considerations are relevant to ontological questions. Part 83. The Metaphysics of Space and Time. Are space and time fundamental features of reality or emergent properties of more basic entities? Substantivalist theories treat space and time as genuine substances or objects that exist independently of their contents. Relationalist theories treat space and time as systems of relations between objects rather than independent entities. This affects whether spatiotemporal properties are intrinsic features of reality or derivative aspects of object arrangements. Substantivalism faces questions about the properties and persistence conditions of space and time themselves. Do spatial regions have intrinsic properties beyond their spatiotemporal relations to other regions? Can the same spatial region exist at different times, or do spatial regions exist timelessly? These questions treat space and time as ordinary objects with identity conditions and modal properties. Relationalism avoids these problems by eliminating space and time as independent entities. Spatial relations like distance and temporal relations like succession exist, but space and time themselves do not exist. This reduces spatio-temporal facts to facts about relations between objects and events. But relationalism faces questions about what grounds spatio-temporal relations and whether they can exist without substantial relata. The debate connects to issues in physics about the nature of space-time and its relationship to matter and energy. General relativity suggests that space-time is dynamic and affected by its material contents. Quantum mechanics raises questions about the fundamental nature of space and time at microscopic scales. The resolution affects whether physics studies the properties of space-time substances or the spatio-temporal relations among material objects. Part 84. Essential versus accidental properties. Objects might have some properties essentially and others accidentally. Essential properties are those an object cannot lose without ceasing to exist, while accidental properties can change without affecting identity. You might essentially be human while accidentally being tall. This distinction grounds facts about what is possible and necessary for particular objects. Essentialism faces questions about which properties are essential and how essential properties are determined. Are essential properties determined by natural kinds, by individual essences, or by conceptual connections? Do essential properties vary across possible worlds, or are they the same in all worlds where the object exists? These questions affect whether essentialism provides objective constraints or merely reflects our conceptual schemes. Different theories propose different sources of essential properties. Natural kind essentialism locates essential properties in membership in natural kinds like biological species or chemical kinds. Origin essentialism argues that facts about origin are essential, so you could not have had different parents. Constitution essentialism claims that material composition determines essential properties of objects. The debate affects modal logic, personal identity, and scientific explanation. If objects have essential properties, then some modal claims have objective truth values independent of our interests. If essential properties are conventional, then modal logic reflects conceptual decisions rather than metaphysical facts. The resolution determines whether possibility and necessity are objective features of reality or subjective aspects of how we think about reality. Part 85. Fundamentality and Metaphysical Hierarchy. Reality might be structured hierarchically, with some entities being more fundamental than others. Physics studies fundamental particles, while chemistry studies atoms and molecules built from those particles. This suggests a layered view of reality where higher levels depend on lower levels in systematic ways. Fundamentality relations create the basic architecture of reality by organizing entities into dependency hierarchies. Different criteria for fundamentality include independence, priority, and explanatory role. Fundamental entities might be those that exist independently of all other entities. Alternatively, fundamental entities might be those that are metaphysically prior in chains of dependence or grounding. Still, another approach focuses on which entities play the most basic explanatory roles in our theories of reality. Questions arise about whether fundamentality admits of degrees and whether there must be absolutely fundamental entities. Could every entity depend on others in an infinite hierarchy with no bottom level? Could fundamentality be relative to contexts rather than involving absolute rankings of entities? These questions affect whether reality has objective structure or whether hierarchies reflect our theoretical perspectives. The notion of fundamentality affects debates about reduction, emergence, and the unity of science. If higher-level entities are less fundamental, then they might be reducible to lower-level entities. If fundamentality creates absolute rankings, then some sciences study more fundamental reality than others. The resolution determines whether reality has objective levels or whether level talk merely reflects pragmatic divisions in our theoretical approaches. Part 86. The Metaphysics of Material Objects. What makes something a unified material object rather than a mere collection of parts or arrangement of matter? The special composition question asks when scattered parts compose genuine wholes rather than remaining separate objects. Different answers generate different ontologies with radically different numbers and types of objects. The resolution affects how we count objects and understand the relationship between parts and wholes. Some philosophers defend unrestricted composition, where any collection of objects automatically composes a larger object. This creates countless strange objects, like the fusion of your left shoe and the Eiffel Tower. Others restrict composition to collections with appropriate unity, function, or causal integration. Still others deny that composition ever occurs, accepting only fundamental simples as genuine objects. Different criteria for composition include contact, fastening, life, organization, and human interests. Objects might compose wholes when they are in contact, physically connected, or functionally integrated. Alternatively, composition might occur when objects serve common purposes or satisfy human interests. Each criterion faces counterexamples and generates different verdicts about borderline cases. The debate has implications for personal identity, artifact identity, and scientific ontology. If composition requires life, then persons are genuine objects, but artifacts are merely arranged simples. If composition is unrestricted, then there are countless person objects corresponding to different ways of delineating boundaries. The resolution affects how many objects exist and what kinds of things deserve to count as unified entities. Part 87. The problem of moral properties. If moral properties exist, what kind of properties are they, and how do they relate to natural properties? Moral realists argue that some actions are really right or wrong independently of what anyone believes about them. But moral properties seem very different from ordinary physical and psychological properties. They appear to involve objective values that go beyond purely descriptive facts about the natural world. Different theories propose different relationships between moral and natural properties. Naturalistic theories identify moral properties with natural properties like promoting happiness or satisfying preferences. Non-naturalistic theories treat moral properties as irreducible sui generis properties that supervene on, but are not identical to natural properties. Error theories deny that moral properties exist and argue that moral discourse involves systematic false beliefs. Moral properties face the challenge of explaining their epistemology and motivational force. How can we gain knowledge of objective moral facts, and why should moral facts motivate action? Natural properties can be detected through empirical investigation, but moral properties seem to require different epistemic methods. The motivational force of moral judgment suggests that moral properties have special connections to human psychology and action. The debate affects broader questions about objectivity, relativism, and the relationship between facts and values. If moral properties are objective, then moral disagreement involves genuine factual disputes rather than mere differences in attitude. If moral properties are relative or non-existent, then moral discourse requires reinterpretation as something other than stating objective truths. The resolution determines whether ethics studies objective features of reality or subjective aspects of human psychology and culture. Part 88. Trope Theory and Property Particulars. Properties might be particular individual things rather than universal entities shared by multiple objects. Each red object has its own particular redness trope that exists in that object alone. This eliminates the problem of how universal properties can be wholly present in multiple locations simultaneously. Tropes are concrete particulars located in space and time rather than abstract universals that exist outside space and time. Trope theory faces the challenge of explaining apparent property sharing and resemblance. If each object has its own private redness trope, why do different red objects seem to share the same property? Trope theorists appeal to resemblance relations among tropes to explain apparent property sharing. But this raises questions about what grounds resemblance relations and whether they are primitive or analyzable. Different versions of trope theory propose different ontologies and different roles for resemblance. Some treat objects as bundles of tropes with no additional substance beyond the tropes themselves. Others accept both tropes and substantial objects that have tropes as non-essential parts. Some invoke exact resemblance, while others allow degrees of resemblance among similar but not identical tropes. The theory affects debates about universals, particulars, and the one-over-many problem. If trope theory is correct, then there are no universal properties shared by multiple objects. The world consists entirely of particular individuals, some of which are objects and others of which are property tropes. This provides a nominalistic solution to the problem of universals while preserving realistic attitudes toward properties as genuine constituents of reality. Part 89. The Metaphysics of Holes. Holes present puzzles about negative space and the ontology of absences. A hole in a piece of cheese seems to be a real feature of the cheese with a definite shape and location. But holes are essentially defined by what is absent rather than what is present. This creates questions about whether absences can be genuine constituents of reality, or whether hole talk is merely a convenient way of describing material arrangements. Realist theories of holes treat them as genuine objects with spatial properties and causal powers. Holes can move when their hosts move, change shape when their boundaries change, and cause effects like letting light or water through. They have clear identity conditions and can be counted, measured, and tracked through time. This suggests that holes deserve inclusion in our ontology as bona fide objects despite their negative character. Anti-realist theories deny that holes exist as objects and explain hole discourse without ontological commitment to holes. To say there is a hole in the cheese is really to say that the cheese is arranged in a certain way without postulating an additional whole entity. Apparent causal effects of holes are really effects of the boundaries and surfaces that surround regions of absence. This eliminates holes from ontology while preserving the utility of hole concepts in describing material arrangements. The debate extends to other absences like shadows, gaps, and empty spaces. If holes exist, then many other types of absences might also deserve recognition as genuine objects. If holes do not exist, then apparent reference to absences requires systematic reinterpretation. The resolution affects broader questions about whether ontology should include negative entities and how absence relates to presence in the structure of reality. Part 90. Absolute versus relational space. Is space a substantial entity that exists independently of its material contents, or is it merely a system of relations among objects? Absolute theories treat space as a container that would exist even if it were completely empty of matter. Relational theories treat spatial facts as facts about distance and direction relations among material objects. This affects whether space itself is a genuine entity or a useful abstraction from more basic relational facts. The debate has implications for motion, acceleration, and the laws of physics. Relational motion between objects. If space is relational, then all motion is relative, and there are no absolute spatial facts beyond relational spatial facts. Newton argued for absolute space based on rotational effects, while Leibniz defended relational space based on the principle of sufficient reason. Modern physics complicates the debate through general relativity and quantum field theory. General relativity treats space-time as dynamic and affected by matter and energy. Quantum field theory suggests that even empty space has structure and energy content. These developments might support substantial views of space or might require new approaches that go beyond the traditional absolute relational distinction. The resolution affects whether physics studies the properties of substantial space-time or the spatio-temporal relations among material objects. If space is substantial, then geometry describes objective features of spatial substance. If space is relational, then geometry describes patterns in the relational facts among objects. This connects to broader questions about the relationship between mathematics and physics in describing the fundamental structure of reality. Part 91. The Metaphysics of Colours. What kind of properties are colours, and where do they exist in the physical world? Colours seem to be genuine features of objects that we perceive through vision. But physics suggests that objects have only microphysical properties, like molecular structure and light-reflecting dispositions. This creates puzzles about whether colours are objective features of reality or subjective aspects of human perception. Different theories locate colours in different places and treat them as different types of properties. Objectivist theories identify colours with physical properties like surface reflectance or wavelength distributions. Subjectivist theories locate colours in the mind as qualitative features of visual experiences. Response-dependent theories treat colours as relational properties involving interactions between objects and perceivers. Colour realism faces the challenge of explaining colour variation and illusion. The same object can appear different colours under different lighting conditions or to different observers. If colours are objective properties of objects, why do they appear so variable and context-dependent? Colour realists must distinguish real colours from apparent colours and explain why perception is so unreliable about objective colour properties. Colour eliminativism argues that colours do not exist, and that colour discourse should be replaced by scientific descriptions. Objects have reflectance properties and wavelength dispositions, but they do not have colour properties as ordinarily conceived. This treats colours like obsolete theoretical entities that should be eliminated from mature ontology. The debate affects broader questions about the relationship between scientific and manifest images of reality and the status of secondary qualities in a scientific worldview. Part 92. The Problem of Temporary Intrinsics. How can objects have incompatible intrinsic properties at different times while remaining numerically identical? A poker can be hot when in the fire and cold when removed, but temperature seems to be an intrinsic property. This creates the puzzle of how the same object can have incompatible intrinsic properties without contradiction. Different solutions preserve either genuine change or strict intrinsicality, but apparently not both together. Endurantist solutions relativize properties to times or invoke different ways of having properties. The poker is hot at time 1 and cold at time 2 without contradiction because the temporal relativization prevents direct contradictions. Alternatively, the poker might have hotness in one way and coldness in another way. These approaches attempt to preserve both genuine change and the intrinsic nature of properties through conceptual innovations. Perdurantist solutions deny that the same object has incompatible properties by distributing properties across temporal parts. The hot temporal part and the cold temporal part are different objects with compatible properties. Change becomes variation across the temporal dimension rather than alteration within persisting objects. This preserves the intrinsic nature of properties by denying that any single object has incompatible properties. The problem tests fundamental assumptions about objects, properties, and time. Solutions must choose between preserving common-sense views of change or common-sense views of intrinsic properties. Each option has costs for other aspects of metaphysical theory. The resolution affects broader debates about persistence, the nature of properties, and the relationship between objects and time. Part 93. Mereological Universalism. Any collection of objects, no matter how scattered or unrelated, automatically composes a larger composite object. Your left shoe, the planet Jupiter, and this sentence together compose a genuine object that exists right now. This principle generates countless bizarre objects that we normally ignore, but that exist according to unrestricted composition principles. Every possible way of selecting objects from the universe creates a corresponding composite object. Universalism solves the special composition question by providing a clear and simple answer that avoids vagueness and arbitrariness. Instead of trying to specify when composition occurs, universalism says composition always occurs for any collection whatsoever. This eliminates borderline cases and provides precise rules that apply uniformly across all possible situations. The price is accepting countless objects that violate common-sense judgments about which collections form genuine wholes. The theory implies that ordinary objects like people and tables have countless overlapping proper parts that we normally ignore. There is an object consisting of your left half plus your right ear, another consisting of your top half plus your bottom quarter, and so on infinitely. Most of these objects lack names or practical significance because they do not correspond to natural boundaries or functional units. But logical principles require their existence as genuine features of the mereological structure of reality. Critics argue that universalism multiplies entities beyond necessity and conflicts with intuitive judgments about composition. They prefer restricted theories that limit composition to collections with appropriate unity or organization. Defenders argue that universalism provides theoretical virtues of simplicity and precision that outweigh intuitive costs. The debate involves questions about whether ontology should follow abstract principles or respect common-sense judgments about the natural world. Part 94. The Metaphysics of Information. Information might be a fundamental feature of reality rather than merely a useful concept for describing complex systems. Some theories suggest that physical properties are really informational properties, and that matter and energy are manifestations of underlying information. This would make information more basic than traditional physical properties in the fundamental structure of reality. Information becomes a metaphysical category rather than just an epistemic or representational notion. Informational approaches to physics suggest that quantum mechanics describes information processing rather than particle behavior. Quantum states might be informational states, and quantum evolution might be information transformation. This could ground physical laws in informational principles rather than material forces or substantial interactions. The physical world becomes a vast information processing system rather than a collection of material objects in space and time. The metaphysics of information faces questions about the relationship between information and consciousness, meaning and representation. Does all information involve consciousness, or can there be unconscious informational states? What makes some informational states meaningful while others are merely syntactic patterns? How does semantic content relate to physical information processing in natural and artificial systems? Different theories propose different relationships between information and traditional metaphysical categories. Some identify information with physical properties, while others treat it as emergent from physical processes. Still others argue that information is fundamental, and that physical properties are informational constructs. The resolution affects whether consciousness, computation, and communication involve fundamental features of reality or merely complex arrangements of non-informational components. Part 95. The Metaphysics of Quantum Mechanics. Quantum mechanics raises fundamental questions about the nature of reality, observation, and physical properties. The measurement problem asks why quantum systems seem to have definite properties only when observed. Different interpretations propose different metaphysical pictures of what quantum mechanics tells us about the fundamental nature of reality. These interpretations have radically different implications for our understanding of objects, properties, and causal relationships. The many-worlds interpretation suggests that all possible quantum outcomes occur in parallel universes. Every quantum measurement splits the universe into multiple branches corresponding to different possible results. This creates vast numbers of parallel worlds that are all equally real but causally isolated from each other. You exist in countless versions across different branches of the universal wave function. Hidden variable theories argue that quantum mechanics is incomplete, and that underlying deterministic variables determine all quantum outcomes. Apparent randomness reflects ignorance of these hidden variables rather than genuine indeterminacy in nature. Collapse theories suggest that quantum states undergo genuine physical collapse when measurements occur. Each interpretation requires different metaphysical commitments about determinism, locality, and the nature of physical properties. The debate affects broader questions about scientific realism, the completeness of physics, and the relationship between observation and reality. If quantum mechanics is fundamental, then reality might be very different from our ordinary experience suggests. The resolution determines whether physics describes objective features of reality or merely correlations in our observations. This connects to fundamental questions about the role of consciousness and measurement in determining the structure of physical reality. Part 96. Metaphysical Grounding. Some facts might hold in virtue of other facts, creating asymmetric dependence relations that structure reality hierarchically. The fact that this apple is red might be grounded in facts about its molecular structure and light-reflecting properties. Grounding relations explain why things are the way they are by showing how complex facts depend on simpler facts. This creates layers of reality with fundamental facts at the bottom and derivative facts at higher levels. Grounding differs from causation because it involves synchronous metaphysical dependence rather than diachronic causal production. Mental facts might be grounded in neural facts without being caused by them. Moral facts might be grounded in natural facts about welfare and preferences. These grounding relations hold timelessly and necessarily rather than involving contingent causal processes. Different theories propose different formal properties for grounding relations. Some argue that grounding is irreflexive, asymmetric and transitive like other dependence relations. Others allow for grounding loops where facts can be mutually grounding in certain circumstances. Still others argue that grounding is context-relative rather than holding absolutely between facts. The notion of grounding promises to illuminate debates about reduction, emergence and fundamentality. If mental properties are grounded in physical properties, this might explain physicalism without requiring strict identity. If normative properties are grounded in natural properties, this might reconcile moral realism with naturalism. But critics question whether grounding is a genuine metaphysical relation or merely a useful theoretical construct for organizing our beliefs about dependence and explanation. Part 97. The Metaphysics of Kinds and Natural Classifications. Reality might contain objective natural kinds that provide the basis for scientific classification and explanation. Biological species, chemical elements, and physical particles might be genuine natural categories rather than human constructions. Natural kinds have essential properties that determine membership and explain why kind members behave similarly across different contexts. Scientific laws and generalizations succeed because they track real patterns in the natural world. Natural kind essentialism argues that kind membership depends on possession of essential properties that cannot change without loss of kind membership. Water essentially has the chemical structure H2O, and anything lacking this structure is not water, regardless of its superficial properties. These essential properties are discovered through scientific investigation rather than stipulated by human decisions. Natural kinds thus have objective boundaries that exist independently of our conceptual schemes and practical interests. Questions arise about which classifications correspond to genuine natural kinds, and which are merely conventional groupings. Are biological species natural kinds with essential properties? Or are they historical lineages without sharp boundaries? Do social categories like race correspond to biological natural kinds, or are they purely social constructions? The answers affect which scientific generalizations are objectively true and which reflect human perspectives on natural variation. The debate has implications for scientific realism, evolutionary theory, and social philosophy. If natural kinds are real, then science discovers objective features of reality rather than imposing human categories on nature. If they are constructions, then scientific classification reflects human interests rather than natural boundaries. The resolution determines whether taxonomy and systematics have objective truth conditions or are merely useful organizing schemes for managing complex information. Part 98. The problem of persistence through vagueness. How can objects persist through periods when their boundaries are vague or indeterminate? A cloud gradually dissipates until it is unclear whether any cloud exists, but it might later reconcentrate into a clear cloud. Or does the original cloud cease to exist, and a new cloud come into existence? This creates puzzles about identity and survival when The problem arises whenever objects have vague persistence conditions that make it unclear when they continue to exist. People gradually lose consciousness under anesthesia and gradually regain it during recovery. Is the same person present throughout the operation, or are there periods when no person exists? Vague persistence conditions make it indeterminate whether particular survival claims are true or false. Different approaches either embrace or eliminate indeterminate persistence. Some argue that there are genuinely indeterminate facts about when objects exist and when they survive. Others argue that apparent indeterminacy reflects ignorance of precise facts about object boundaries and persistence conditions. Still others deny that vague objects exist and argue that reality contains only objects with precise boundaries. The problem connects to broader issues about vagueness, identity, and the determinacy of reality. If persistence can be indeterminate, then identity relations might be vague rather than always determinate. This challenges classical logic and requires new approaches to reasoning about identity and existence. The resolution affects fundamental questions about whether reality has completely determinate structure or contains irreducible indeterminacies that resist precise description. Part 99. The unity of science and metaphysical levels. Do different sciences study different levels of reality, or do they all ultimately describe the same underlying physical reality? Reductionist approaches argue that higher-level sciences are in principle reducible to lower-level sciences, with physics as the fundamental base. Anti-reductionist approaches argue that different sciences study genuinely different levels of reality with autonomous causal powers. This affects whether reality has a unified structure or consists of irreducibly different levels of organization. The unity of science thesis suggests that all genuine scientific knowledge can be integrated into a single comprehensive theory. Psychology reduces to neuroscience, which reduces to biochemistry, which reduces to physics. This creates a hierarchical picture where higher-level sciences are useful for practical purposes but not metaphysically fundamental. Ultimate reality consists only of fundamental physical particles and forces described by basic physics. Emergentist approaches argue that higher-level properties and processes are irreducible to lower-level descriptions. Life, consciousness and social phenomena might involve genuine novelty that cannot be predicted from purely physical descriptions. Different levels of reality have their own causal powers and laws that supplement rather than reduce to physical causation. This creates a pluralistic picture where reality contains multiple autonomous levels rather than a single fundamental level. The debate affects scientific methodology, explanation, and the relationship between different research programs. If reductionism is correct, then all explanation ultimately appeals to fundamental physical processes. If emergence is genuine, then different sciences study genuinely different aspects of reality that cannot be unified into a single theory. The resolution determines whether interdisciplinary integration aims at reduction or coordination among autonomous but interacting levels of scientific investigation. Part 100. The ultimate nature of reality. What is the fundamental character of existence itself beyond all particular features and distinctions? Is reality ultimately physical, mental, neutral, or something entirely beyond these categories? This question asks about the intrinsic nature of being rather than its structural features or relational properties. Different answers provide different foundations for understanding everything else that exists. Physicalism argues that reality is fundamentally physical, with everything else being constructed from or reducible to physical components. Mental properties, social institutions, and abstract objects are ultimately physical arrangements or physical dispositions. Idealism argues that reality is fundamentally mental, with apparent physical objects being constructions within consciousness or mind. Neutral monism suggests that both mental and physical properties are manifestations of some more basic neutral reality. Some approaches argue that the ultimate nature of reality is unknowable or ineffable. We can only know structural and relational features of reality, never its intrinsic qualitative nature. Others argue that the question itself is meaningless because reality has no nature beyond its structural and causal features. Still others propose that reality is fundamentally informational, processual, or consists of pure mathematical structure without any further qualitative nature. This final question brings together all the other metaphysical questions we have explored. The nature of objects, properties, time, space, consciousness, and existence itself all contribute to our understanding of reality's fundamental character. Different answers provide different frameworks for understanding our place in the cosmos and the nature of everything that exists. The quest to understand the ultimate nature of reality remains the deepest and most enduring challenge in all of metaphysical inquiry, connecting our most abstract theoretical questions to our most personal questions about the meaning and significance of existence itself.